Hello, my fellow Westorians. We are back. Welcome to another installment of the rabbit hole filled exploration of the world of Ice and Fire. We're having so much fun, and we've only just gotten started. It's only episode 3 of this reread, and we've got a special guest today. Welcome to History of Westeros podcast, co-author of the world of Ice and Fire, Elio M. Garcia Jr. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you for having me on. It's very exciting. Great to talk to you again after I think we last really spoke in Dublin. So it's
Yeah.
a great chance, and Ash as well. So no, fantastic. Thank you.
Right on. Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'm going to praise you wholeheartedly and thoroughly here at the beginning, so hopefully we don't make you blush. You are sort of one of the rare cases, we could say, where someone has sort of ascended from fan to, well, another level. You started very early on. You found the books, well, the book, when it was just one book, let's be clear. You've been around for a long time in the fandom, and you not only are the co-author of The World of Ice and Fire, which is our main subject matter, and the World of Ice and Fire app, by the way, y'all. That's a very useful thing. Not only does it's a lot easier to carry around than that big book, but it has some of the Winds of Winter chapters in it, the pre-release chapters that we've reviewed on here and that are out elsewhere. So it's also nice for that purpose, as well as some other things, some things that are not in the World of Ice and Fire book. So quick reminder to check that out as well. But you're also the co-founder of Westeros.org, which is how I got started in the fandom. So that's particularly close to my heart. And well, that's a huge resume, but there's already more to say. What just briefly, how did Westeros.org come about, and anything you want to say about it?
Sure. Well, the books came out right at a time when the internet was becoming more accessible to people. It wasn't just kids; it was like college accounts. You started having like AOL would have an Earthlink and all these others showed up ISPs allow you to connect the internet. And fans discovered that, hey, we could use the internet to discuss things with people who are in other states, in other cities, in other countries. So Linda kind of led me to the books, or the book.
Yeah, the book.
She really got me to read it, and we got involved in the early fandom, basically the earliest message boards, Dragonstone, which was in Australia, and then when that one died. Someone named Revanchi, that was her handle, made a forum, and I became a moderator on that. And then when she went to medical school, she handed over that forum to me. And out of all of that, we decided to have our own website for the fandom to kind of cover news, to be a place for the game we were making based on Ice and Fire, with George's permission. And it just became like the hub for news information, the So Speak Martin collection, where people would send out the emails they got from George, so everyone could have access to what he was saying. And we've been running it ever since. Someone actually recently asked me the actual date of when we officially opened, and it was like, I think it was like August 2000.
Oh, wow.
Something like that. We had registered the site earlier, and we had an earlier version that wasn't Westeros. It was like on Zoom.com, one of those early free website things. But
Wow.
The proper Westeros.org was in August, or I think August 2000 is the actual date.
How weird is it that people, newborns from August 2000, are grown college graduates now reading this book
Yeah, they're
and
like
looking at your website,
sitting down to have a beer as they talk about it.
No, it makes one feel old, older, anyways, and we've had people who met through our forum, through our who we fell in love, got married, had kids. Those kids are now going off to college. It's
wild.
I feel it's a great privilege to have had whatever role we had in providing that forum for people to meet up, and but it does put things in perspective. That time stops for no man.
It sure is gotten so much bigger. I mean, it's hard to I'm sure, like Han Solo, you can imagine quite a lot, but did you imagine it could ever have grown to this size?
No. I mean,
yeah,
no,
I didn't
not
think
really.
so.
I mean, what we had was like Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time was the series that was kind of like the model in a lot of ways for the fandom, because there was this early Usenet news group. I don't know if anyone knows what Usenet is anymore.
I barely remember it.
Yeah, it was a way for people to kind of create little areas where they could communicate and trade posts and topics about things. And so that was the first real model for it, and it was pretty big, but it wasn't as it didn't, and it was bigger than Ice and Fire for a long time. But obviously, the TV show changed that and made it just huge
just
in a way that
balloon. Explosion, whatever word, whatever adjective, you could use them all. So, and that of course had a big impact on all of us. Our, having the show created a lot more readers, which in turn created a lot more people on the forums and on podcasts and things like that. A lot of most of the podcasts didn't even exist back then. We didn't exist until early season 1, late season 1, early season 2, in between, something like that. And we were pretty unofficial then as well. Now, you also are the manager / administrator, owner, I'm not sure what the right term is, or all those things, of Wiki of Ice and Fire, which personally is invaluable to us as a reference material. So that is fantastic. Now, how did that come about? Is that an offshoot of Westeros.org?
Well, yes, basically. I mean, since we host Westeros on our own server, when we founded the wiki, it was basically out of necessity, because at that point in time, the Wikipedia had articles about Ice and Fire. It had like character articles, and basically there was this whole thing where administrators were removing what they called fan crufts from Wikipedia. They were deleting stuff and saying this is a article about Ice and Fire is fine, but articles about all these characters and events is not fine for the wiki. It's not what we're supposed to be about. So people kind of asked us, can we help them set up a wiki just for Ice and Fire? We decided, we have the resources, we have the time, so sure, we'll do it. I mean, we've been very hands off. We've run it. We've made sure that it can. And when Game of Thrones came out, I mean, the major reason over several seasons that the forum and the website would crash was because of the wiki getting so much traffic.
Oh wow! I remember those crashes, some of them anyway.
Yeah, it took a long time to figure out how to manage it. Like in the end, we had to kind of ramp up like 3 different servers and pull together all our resources to be able to make it work. So it was really just kind of out of necessity, I think, and we've kept it up since then, and it's entirely fan edited. I've contributed just very little other than making sure it runs and helping kind of resolve disputes at times about certain things, about how we do things, but otherwise it's been 100% the community has been running it.
Did the concordance predate the wiki, or did that come about afterwards?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I was about to ask that exact question.
Nice.
The concordance was now the concordance is one of those things that came out of, there was a Wheel of Time concordance, which was a proper concordance in the sense that if you know what a concordance is supposed to be an alphabetical listing. Is organized alphabetically, and ours is not. We just use the term as a nod to them. But no, I created that largely for our game. The idea is that we would kind of put all these little factual details in one place for our players to be able to refer to easily without having to go to the books, or if they wanted to go and double check, it would be a page. But I did that all manually by hand, entering into documents, and then eventually across multiple HTML pages. I don't know if Wikipedia or MediaWiki, the software, existed then. I had never heard of it. I don't think when I started, I didn't think of trying to set up a database or set up a wiki. Like that wasn't an idea. Like I'll set up a wiki to put all this stuff in. In retrospect, it probably would have made a lot more sense to just put it all into a wiki. But the concordance is a very odd project in the sense that it's. I sent it to Anne Grohl and George early on, and they actually asked. I gave it to George, and he told Anne about it. And Anne asked for it because they used it as a reference early on when they were editing as well. So that was a positive thing. But it's very much a weird fan labor of love, which I'm not sure is very useful for people, but
I had a lot of fun.
It was useful at the time.
Looking through it when I first got into the series, because there is the wiki, but there's something a little different about the concordance. I don't know, that I really got a kick out of.
It's like, yeah, it has that early feel to it. I mean, it's like a founding document, sort of. You know, it's part of the history. I'd say it's its own like scroll. It's like a scroll. Yeah, it's an ancient scroll.
Yeah.
But this is why I wanted to start with this. In part was because this is how things grew. This is the beginning of what grew into the necessity for something like the World of Ice and Fire. Because you go back to those old interviews with George, and he's like, "No, the world building is I just write what I need for the story." Clearly, things have exceeded that at this point. He can't just keep it all in his head anymore. He can't just have a list. He can't just have right. It's just gotten bigger and bigger, and nobody could keep it all in their heads. I mean, that's why we come here every week to talk about it. Or part of it, or part of the reason anyway. So that's just fascinating. It really did. That seminal line, "The tale grew in the telling," is just incredibly apt in a lot of ways, and this is one of them.
Yeah.
So one of the things we like to do at the beginning of every show, it's an odd thing, Elio, is we like to let Sean do his best Aryan Bright Flame impression and tell us what very odd beverage he's drinking today.
This is I think it might be similar to one I had last week or a couple weeks ago. The naked drink, the blue or the berry protein naked drink mixed with Bang, a new discovery.
More Bang.
Yes, this is the blue raspberry Bang, which is a sugar-free energy drink that we discovered from this show called How To with John Wilson. It's a kind of comedic documentary show, but anyway, I've got my caffeine, I've got my nutrients, I have less sugar than normal, little carbonation. It's so
This is
good.
a healthy drink for Sean.
It's like 10 years from now, Sean's going to be like running out of ideas. It's going to be like one of those things where like YouTubers that just like keep having to go farther and farther to like stay relevant. He's like, now I put gasoline and gravel and
goat milk.
Yeah, and goat milk and the blood of a baby carried off by a vulture. Oh, whoops. Okay, so also shout out since we mentioned the Wiki of Ice and Fire, I want to give a shout out to our friend Rhoynish Targaryen, who is one of the editors over there. Does a lot, has contributed quite a lot to the wiki, and has also contributed to History of Westeros podcast on a good bit of our scripted episodes. We've had her check things out and make sure we haven't made any mistakes, and that's worked out very well. Also, shout out to Nina, Good Queen Alley, 1L at .tumblr.com, providing excellent notes as always. Elio, you mentioned that the last time we saw each other was in Ireland, and yeah, that was a lot of fun. We got to hang out for TitanCon, and that's really when George is really in his element in places like that because he's become such a celebrity. But when you go to a small convention like that, he gets to still kind of be a fan, sort of like the rest of us. I mean, he's never not going to be George R. R. Martin, but he gets to be back to his roots, and that's where he has a lot more fun. And do you recall discussing a Vagar, the color of Vagar at lunch with him?
Yes. No, that was great fun. That really is his element. I mean, I remember this from the first World Con we went to in Glasgow, and just it was breakfast time, and we were all waiting for George to read from. It must have been from A Dance with Dragons.
Okay.
And he was getting breakfast, and we all just sat around him while he was and chatted with him while he was getting breakfast. So it was the same kind of thing when I went in there to the was the Hilton? Is that the hotel there? Into that area, the restaurant or whatever. And there was George, and there were you guys and a few other fans
It was fun.
just hanging out with him, and so he just sat down and joined you all, and yeah, it was great fun. And I know he did it several times. That's what he loves, when he can just be at a convention, a small convention, and it's not like all these people gawking at him. It's just like, oh, it's George.
Yeah.
You still had people coming by who wanted to say things or get autographs or photos or whatever, but for the most part, it was a lot more of a calm situation for him. I think he really enjoyed that.
Yeah, it was really fun, and you could tell he just had that smile all the time. So, folks, what we're going to do today, and we've been talking about community stuff. We've talking about history, meta history, and Elio's large contributions to this fandom. We're going to talk a little more about process and George and the creation of this book, but we're going to try to stick mostly to in-world stuff throughout this episode. The bulk of this episode, we're going to geek out on the material itself. But, one reason for that is that, Elio, you've been interviewed about this book a few times already. We don't want to repeat what's been said. We're going to give links to people to see the other places you've been interviewed for other coverage of this. But we don't want to cover ground that's been covered before. And you're a fan, first of all. After all, we just explored that, how you got started. And that's what we are. So that's where we'll keep our focus. It's so cool that you are... or half of, anyway, however you want to frame it, Maester Yandel. That's so neat. How did that come about, this idea of you actually being an in-world Maester, and anything else you want to tell us, like the name? How did the name Yandel come about?
This is my big question, how did the name, did you guys come up with the name Yandel? Did George, is it a reference to something? Tell us more.
Yes. So the conceit actually came up when we had our first proper sit-down meeting of George and Anne Grohl at the Los Angeles, or the Anaheim Worldcon in 2006. That's where we got the contract to sign and everything. And we talked about it, and one of the things George said, and it was over breakfast at the convention, said like he was really concerned about having an omniscient perspective in the book that kind of knows everything and just lays it out. He wanted something where there could be misinformation, there could be things that are wrong, or things that are unexplained, or things that have just ambiguity. And we, as I mentioned, we came out from the Wheel of Time fandom prior to coming to Ice and Fire.
Yeah.
And the Wheel of Time fandom had gotten its own the world of Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, or also known as the Big White Book of Bad Art. George actually referenced it when we were discussing it, because he said, he wanted art, but he didn't want it to be like the Jordan book, which was known as the Big Bad Book of Bad, because and it's a long story. It's not the artist's fault. Tor shortchanged him, and Jordan was really upset about it. But in any case,
it's so weird.
So we proposed, and that book uses the perspective of a scholar writing about the setting. So that allowed that conceit of, well, there could be things that are wrong, there could be things that are unclear, and we thought, well, it's perfect. We have maesters. We'll say it's a maester writing it, or we'll say it's a maester or several maesters writing it, and that's where it kind of came. The idea came where we would have our maester, and then George would have his own maester, and the idea is sometimes they would have. Initially, the idea was that there might be different perspectives from these maesters, in particular, like on magic. George had this idea about his character, who wasn't named yet. It came later of a name, but his maester would be, I think, anti-magic, and but I had already said, and then Yandel would be pro-magic. But that kind of filtered away. That wasn't really a thing per se. I think Yandel became, as you can, if you read it closely, he's constantly kind of, magic existed once, it doesn't exist anymore, and he
downplays it.
As to his name, Yandel is how I say it. It's just an odd use of the Y.
Okay.
And Elio and Linda.
There we go. There we go. We looked at it, we're like, this has to be a reference, but what? Okay.
We missed that. We thought maybe there was your name or her name or your names were in there somehow. We did not figure that out. That's
there
cool.
was an L
I'm abusing that Y as a vowel a little bit to get that to work. But,
so that's not a hint at how to pronounce yarnwood.
No.
Ironwood.
Yeah, that's Ironwood for sure. But that said, and when I mentioned it to George, I mentioned I had gotten the idea from a pair of brothers who wrote together science fiction in, I think, like the 30s or 40s or 50s, E&O Binder, and it was Ernst and Otto Binder, and so they wrote together as E&O Binder. So George liked that because he loves his science fiction and history. So Gildane, I can't tell you where Gildane. George just came up with that one.
Just Gildane, cool. Just from the mind of George, right on. That's so cool. Yeah, we love this. So this opening passage, Sean, would you like to read, or Shay, one of you all read this Yandel passage, and we'll have a little fun with it.
I'll go, I guess.
You got it? Okay.
I was a foundling from my birth in the 10th year of the reign of the last Targaryen king, left on a morning in an empty stall in the scribe's hearth, where acolytes practiced the art of letters for those who had need. The course of my life was set that day, when I was found by an acolyte who took me to the seneschal of that year, Archmaester Edgerin. Edgerin, whose ring and rod and mask were silver, looked upon my squalling face and announced that I might prove of use. When first told this as a boy, I took it to mean that he foresaw my destiny as a maester. Only much later did I come to learn from Archmaester Ebros that Edgerin was writing a treatise on the swaddling of infants and wished to test certain theories.
So we discussed this from a different angle at the beginning, because it's right here at the beginning of the book. But is there anything about this passage you can tell us, or anything? Because it just seems kind of like George is having a bit of fun with that. Like he's maybe teasing a little bit.
I wish I could credit George, but that was 100% Linda and I.
Oh, very good.
Nice.
Heck yeah.
We tried to capture I thought I would try to capture George's sense of humor somewhere.
Well, it worked on me. I thought it was him.
Oh no, thank you. I really tried. I thought that was a funny joke. The name Edgerin, that's a very French medieval name.
It is
Okay.
Edgerin. We talked about this in a previous week. Aziz said Edgerin and I said Edgerin, and so I went with his pronunciation. But I was right.
Shea wins this round.
It's a real name.
That's cool. All right, we're clarifying so many things here. This is great. So yeah, that's really cool. So yeah, so that's a good clarification to make. It's stated sort of in interviews and other places that you all were responsible for parts of this book, and in particular some of the archmaesters and names of books and things like that. But yeah, this is a good example that we didn't intend, but it serves very well as an example of a part that you wrote that speaks in George's voice, but it's your character, so it also makes sense that it's coming from you. So that's great. I love that we stumbled on it that way. What's your thoughts on in-world? Speaking from an in-world perspective, Yandel he finished the book in a few years before Robert's death, if that's right. But when do you think he started it?
Yeah. That's a good question. It was kind of funny. I was thinking about this, and I saw. I mean, I'm sure your viewers know you have a document with it's a rough outline of things.
Yeah.
It made me think a bit, because one of the ideas I've always said is, the idea that Yandel wants to present it to Robert, or he goes to King's Landing, he's waiting to present it to the king, and hope that the king will like it, and that'll lead to people copying it and disseminating it, and that's his great goal. And then obviously the joke is, he has to scratch out Robert's name and Robert dies, and then he has to scratch out Joffrey's name and Joffrey dies, and he's still there. And George asked, at Archipelicon, or was it in Belfast? I can't remember where. What do I think Yandel's doing now? I said he's still waiting for someone to see him and receive the book and tell him it's good. But the thing about it in my head is, how does he afford to stick around?
Yeah, the Citadel's not paying for him to be there, are they?
Yeah, I mean, Morwen can take off to the east. Did he trade his skill as a healer and his knowledge? So I mean, is Yandel going out every morning, treating merchants and scribing, copying notes for people?
Is he being put up by Pycelle? Maybe
he's a freelance
quarters
maester?
for maester visitors.
Well, not by Pycelle anymore.
My thought is that he's a maester from the Citadel who was at the Citadel and had decided once he had this done he was going to take off, and so somehow he must have put together a little bit of money and has decided to chance this thing. But I imagine when he did it, I really don't have a great sense of it. I haven't really thought that far about it. I don't want to give a date and people say, "Oh, that's too fast."
Yeah.
What I would say is my idea was always that when he found Gildayne's material is what kind of really sparked his interest. Now, of course, there has been a change in Gildayne's material between the publication of the Fowlers and Fire and Fire and Blood.
Yes.
Namely that when we wrote the Fowlers and Fire, George had basically agreed with the idea that Gildayne was a dead person and had died well before the time of Robert Baratheon. But when Fire and Blood became a thing, he decided that it would be easiest for him to stick to that voice. So Gildayne has become someone who is very much still alive. So we have made some adjustments to later editions to try and make it mesh, I think. At least we submitted them. I can't recall if they've actually gone through to try and make it mesh better. But in any case, my idea is still that inspired him anyways. This Archmaester Gildayne's work on the history of Targaryens, and he thought, that's all well and good, but how about something more general, aimed for people who came out of similar circumstances? Yandel was a foundling, probably of impoverished background, but he doesn't know his parents, but he must assume they were probably impoverished people. And what hope would they have of hearing about all these great things and learning these things unless someone writes a general history for them?
That is so cool. We appreciate that a lot because, yeah, most history books, especially in a medieval setting, are not written for the common folk. They're written for their patrons, the ones who paid for it to be made in the first place or what have you,
Exactly.
or to make it flattering about them. It's something.
Yeah, I appreciate it a lot too because George has talked so much about how he likes popular histories and how he likes, playing with that concept of what goes down into the popular history versus the, more legitimate histories and all that. And this is a great example of it.
Yeah.
I wonder if Yandel ever would have interacted with Alistair Thorne, waiting to.
Oh my goodness, that's a great question.
Not very possibly. I doubt Ford would have given much time for a maester wearing a chain.
Sure.
I have to imagine he would look down on someone like that. It's all about quills and
Yandel might have been
scrolls.
like, "What you got in that jar there? What is that? It's like, is that a hand? What? Why do you have that?" He's like, "Shut up, Maester. Get out of my face." But that's really neat, though. Also, his inspiration, because that's kind of how I got inspired. I'm gonna, praise you again. But when I came to Westeros.org, the forums for the first time, I've told my listeners this, or listeners out there, so many times, but I felt like Jon Snow. I was like, oh boy, I know nothing, because I didn't even know R + L = J when I came to the forums. I had all these other ideas, but once I realized I didn't even know that basic thing, I'm like, all right, dial it back. Need to do some reading and learning here. But that was inspiring. It was like, wow, there is so much here. And that's how I feel like Yandel, he's like, wow, this is really interesting. This is inspiring to me. Other people will be inspired by this. And, well, that's part of why we're all here. We love learning. We love this sort of exercise, this sort of experience, this sort of imagining.
A little bit of a tangent, but I do want to point out the idea that I guess a couple of connected ideas. One is that the idea of something is really good. It can't really be spoiled. Knowing what's going to happen in the end doesn't ruin the story, right? So I think that's important in general. And in the context of how big this world and this story have gotten, it's hard for someone to come in not knowing anything, And even I, coming into Game of Thrones, watching the TV show, Aziz and, several of our friends, my circle, people at work had read these books and would have discussions. They were passionate discussions about these characters that people had never heard of. But I just knew that Jaime was a favorite of several of my friends. And so when I start watching the show, and he's kind of this arrogant,
you're like, why do people like this guy?
I just knew there had to be more to it. Does that make sense? There's no way he's just this one-sided evil villain when he's a favorite character of some of my friends. So anyway, just a neat idea that sometimes having little hints of knowledge about something can actually add greater value or curiosity, can cause you to dig deeper, etc. So, and it's great there are resources out there to do that with. There's definitely much more depth to the story than what's on the surface. It's something it's part of why it's so successful, and people read it multiple times because there is so much more than just on the surface. And even the surface is pretty freaking entertaining. So.
Yep. Good said, Sean. Good said. So this one of the many rabbit holes this book provides to us is small and large was this concept of adoption. I want to spend just a few minutes on this. You mentioned that it's very likely Yandel. I can't get myself used to this other pronunciation. It'll take me a little while.
Any pronunciation you want. Nice, like George says.
That's true. That's one of our favorite things to quote that George says.
Yeah, and so adoptions, like you said, he was probably come from an impoverished family. That makes sense. After all, lordly families have so much money. Even the poor ones can afford one extra mouth to feed most of the times. Maybe not like a real minor house, but in dire straits. But generally speaking, one more baby around isn't going to make a big difference. But to a more typical common-born family, that's a huge difference. But I don't imagine leaving kids at the Citadel is super common. Maybe it's more common in Old Town. We briefly brought this up just as a question that we can't expect to have an answer on, but I wondered if you have any thoughts on this, Elio, because certainly adoption is a big part of the story, given Jon and then Griff, young Griff, Illyrio. Tyrion probably isn't adopted, but that subject comes up, so it's still relevant, even if that's just a dead theory or a missed theory.
Right. I can't give like a definitive answer on it because George liked what we did with Yandel and his history, so it must be at least plausible enough. But with the bit with Ebros kind of noting that Egron wanted to use him for some experiments, basically, my take would be that usually, if anyone tries to leave a child to the Citadel, it's fairly rare that they're actually kept. They probably pass them on to some mother house or some orphanage or something. I don't think they make a habit of taking in infants, because that's a lot of effort. They're going to have servants taking care of them, raising them to a certain point where they can become useful.
Especially when there's no women allowed at the Citadel, right? So who's going to breastfeed
breastfeed? Yeah, I mean, goat's milk, I gather, works, but they're going to have...
they allow women goats?
So I figure it's fairly rare. It is unusual.
Yeah.
It would be unusual.
We were, given that he's probably in King's Landing, like you said, we were wondering if there's a chance he would pop up just like in a one line in one of the books. We thought maybe he could pop up at the Citadel. Maybe Sam could run into him. But if he's in King's Landing, I guess that wouldn't happen. But maybe he's forced to go back. I mean, it could be more.
Prologue.
It could be more than one. I'm just saying, like, at least
you
one.
Mean you
line.
want him dead?
One line would do a lot for us. We would want more, but yeah.
Well,
it would be worth it. It'd be worth him giving his life.
Well, I mean, George did kind of, when I said the story that he was while hanging around King's Landing waiting to present the book, and he kind of smiled and said, "And you'll think you'll keep his head."
He might want to leave.
The prologue might be on point there.
And if maybe he does, it's unsafe in King's Landing, especially with the Griff and all that business happening, and Cersei getting a little even more dangerous. But heck, if there's a faceless man in the Citadel, it's not exactly safe there either. So, or if Euron's about to come, I mean, there's really no place safe, and even for the Maesters, life isn't safe in Westeros these days.
No, especially with the compromises he made on the history of the rebellion and so on. There might be some people very unhappy with him if they actually looked at it.
He might not have been safer without compromise, so...
it was
damned if he does, damned if he doesn't.
Exactly.
That's true. Okay, well, let's get to the coming of the first men. Elio is a big fan of Dorne, and it's the first place that people crossing the land bridge from Essos to Westeros would get to, so it's a pretty nice convergence for us. Let's start off with this excellent quote from the book.
According to the first most well-regarded accounts from the Citadel, anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 years ago, in the southernmost reaches of Westeros, a new people crossed the strip of land that bridged the narrow sea and connected the eastern lands with the land in which the children and giants lived. It was here that the first men came into Dorne via the Broken Arm, which was not yet broken. Why these people left their homelands is lost to all knowing, but when they came in force. Thousands entered and began to settle the lands, and as the decades passed, they pushed farther and farther north. Such tales as we have of those migratory days are not to be trusted, for they suggest that within a few short years, the first men had moved beyond the neck, into the north. Yet, in truth, it would have taken decades, even centuries, for this to occur. What does seem to be accurate from all the tales, however, is the first men soon came to war with the children of the forest. Unlike the children, the first men farmed the land and raised up ring forts and villages, and in doing so, they took to chopping down the weirwood trees, including those with carved faces, and for this, the children attacked them. leading to hundreds of years of war.
Yeah, so that's pretty scary. Like, imagine you're, from either perspective, we've talked about it from the children's perspective, but let's talk about it from the first men's perspective. You're crossing over, for whatever reason, that part is lost to history. There's a decent chance it's climate change or war or both, following the herds, etc. But it's also possible some people even settled on the arm for a while, which is a nice little interesting side thing to imagine. But coming across, they'd find these very mysterious trees, and eventually they'd come into direct contact with the children. And I wonder things like how did it go at first, right? Like, there's definitely chopping down of the trees. That may have been the thing that started the conflict. But I doubt it was just immediately humans started crossing the land bridge and just immediately started chopping down werewoods, targeting them. There was probably some cut down pretty quickly. But I wonder how quickly this all devolved or how quickly it got out of hand. And looking at it from the other angle, there's lots of stories of positive interactions. There's trade. There's, going farther down the line, there's obviously shared religion. That comes, after the pact, I suppose, or maybe before. So within all this, Elio, this is one of the most fascinating points of history, and it's also one of the most mysterious. When this part of the book was being written, what was going through your mind? What kind of things were you trying to get out of it, or whatever you want to say about this stuff? We'd love to hear.
Yeah, we really used quite heavily Maester Lewin's account in Game of Thrones to Bran and Rickon about the history there, and we talked a bit with George about it. But yeah, he didn't want to reveal too much. That material was us basically. So obviously he signed off on it. He looked at it, and this is a Maester's account, and it's as plausible account as any other Maester's of how it went. Obviously, in my mind, you have to look a lot about sort of, the discovery of a new world from the European perspective, and sort of the early colonials, their first contacts with the indigenous peoples. You could go further back, of course, to the Vikings having come across the Skraelings in Greenland and Vinland, as they called them, and those interactions. And so I would suppose that at first it's a lot like it's probably a very careful entry to begin with. You're in a completely new place. You're running, or you're doing, for whatever reason, you've come here. You've been pushed here, have chosen to come here. There's surely plenty of land for everybody to begin with, but I would guess the first conflicts would probably come when people not knowing that those carved trees mattered, and just chopping them down, and that would probably start the first conflicts, and then maybe they start learning, no, these trees matter to these children, as we call them, and
like, for example, here's an interesting. Let me throw
yeah.
something out at you. There would have been a difficulty for the first men, even very early on, even understanding why necessarily the children were coming after them. They're cutting down these trees, but they don't necessarily know that's the cause and effect. The children obviously are like, they're cutting down our trees. This must stop. This is our life. This is our religion, our everything, our memories. You really wonder how that was communicated. Like, they point at the tree saying, don't do that, say stop or something like that. They don't even have a language to. That would have been very difficult.
Another challenge would be, even if they are able to communicate to them, do they communicate it to all of them all at once?
Yeah, right. Yeah, this is.
Imagine waves are coming across, and maybe enough to settle and have some sort of leadership, some sort of meeting with the children of the forest. But eventually more people come, and a generation passed, and more of them travel farther north and interact with new children of the forest. And they don't. And so you can see how the children of the forest as a whole just start to think of, all these newcomers are chopping down our trees. It's bad. We have to stop.
Yeah, and
they're not distinguishing between who's new and who got talked to or whatever.
They probably don't have a great conception of difficulty to communicate, the children, considering how they can just communicate with each other. They don't understand the very concept that all the first men can't reach each other.
That's a good point.
Yeah. They must know, and they're doing this anyway, and so they attack them. And so eventually the first men also feel the same thing. All these children attack us. Even if we stop chopping down our trees, they attack us anyway. So you could see how this would just perpetuate itself. Even once they got past the tree thing, there's still going to be retribution for my uncle that you killed or my child or on and on, you know. I think about that a lot, like with the conflict in, I don't know, I don't want to get too political, but like whenever some Palestine makes some treaty with Israel, whatever those leaders decide, it doesn't affect the kid on the street whose dad was killed last week in a bombing. You know? So,
yeah, that's true.
Right. Also, I mean, this the tree thing. Obviously, at a certain point, once it starts getting really ugly, I mean, they start deliberately cutting down the trees because they have this. We're seeing from the eyes; they're able to spy on us, so we're attacking the trees to deny them that, and that just kind of perpetuates it even more and makes it even hotter. So the pact was, I think, very important. But you know, before that, we have the children raising their magic allegedly to break the bridge. Too late, but they tried. To bring down the hammer of the waters, and obviously Yandel has various maesters sort of speculations about what really happened or how it really worked, and so on.
Yeah, it's super neat. I like that. We'll get to that pretty soon. The one other thing that I think is really fascinating to think about is like since the children didn't build much in the way of structures other than their little tree towns, which may have gone unnoticed by a lot of humans. Certainly people wouldn't have seen much inside the caves. The carved werewoods would be the only sign of any sort of habitation by any other being that I can think of, unless with the exception of very rare things like the possibility that the sea stone chair was already there. But that was, there's only aside from exceptions like that, that's just really spooky. You come into a new land and there's carved trees and there's no people anywhere. You're like, well, who did that? We can't also forget that there was also prehistoric version of animal. Yeah, giants, huge lions. Well, actually, let's have the next quote because they're mentioned in here.
Oh, baby.
The first men who had brought with them strange gods, horses, cattle, and weapons of bronze were also larger and stronger than the children, and so they were a significant threat. The hunters among the children, their wood dancers, became their warriors as well. But for all their secret arts of tree and leaf, they could only slow the first men in their advance. The Greenseers employ their arts, and tales say that they could call the beasts of marsh, forest, and air to fight on their behalf. Dire wolves as monstrous as snow bears, cave lions and eagles, mammoths and serpents, and more.
There's a lot of nasty sounding animals, and if they're being controlled directly with a higher intelligence, then they're pretty deadly. Now, of course, it's hard to have full armies of that. This is why it was, more piecemeal. But that's terrifying too. I mean, think about the prologue to A Dance with Dragons with Varamir, where when Varamir's dad didn't know which of their dogs killed his brother, and so he killed all the dogs. That's a haunting scene because anyone who loves dogs, which is, heck, most of us, that's really sad. You also kind of have to understand from the parents' perspective, it's like, I don't know which of these dogs killed my kid, but I can't take that risk. You kind of understand where he's coming from. But if you have children doing that on purpose as a weapon, like Varamir didn't know what he was doing. He was a kid that was he's a kind of a sociopath kid, but still, he didn't necessarily have motive before all this. Like, I'm going to slip into this dog skin and kill my brother. That wasn't necessarily what he set out to do. It's what happened. But with Greenseers in this prehistoric era, like, would people even be able to trust their dogs? It's just kind of hard. It's like really sad to think about that. Like, all the animals were potentially traitors or weapons for the children. Wow.
No, that's a great point. Actually, I never really thought about that. The Greenseer can slip into the skin of your horse, your dog, and who knows how often they might have thrown some chieftain off their horse.
Oh, that's a great point.
Trampled them, things like that. And then because mostly what we hear from Lewin is their darts, their stone darts, arrows coming out of the forest and so on. But I could have seen the Greenseers doing things like that. And that would have been very frightening, especially since we have no real sign that the first men had any magic of that type. Obviously, there's the whole thing about the runes and rune armor and so on, but we don't really know too well about that side of things.
Yeah, I wonder if they would have called on their gods that hardly exist anymore. We only hear about them briefly. In this book is one place we do hear about them. These old sea gods and wind gods and nature gods that they worship that don't even have names anymore. they would be beseeching them for help or for some sort of insight or what do we do? Yeah, that's really interesting to consider. And let's take that a little bit farther. Think about when Bran was injured, when he fell. Now he's maybe different because of his blood and his heritage, but I wonder if that's another thing that, as a weapon, they maybe tried to do some, I don't know, Freddy Krueger stuff, getting into people's dreams and trying to like mess with them. I don't know if that's even possible, but like for children, it might be more possible. And I mean, when I say children, I mean young humans. I mean, like getting into their head because they're a little more impressionable. They're not as disciplined and mind-wise. That's kind of scary, isn't it?
Yeah, that would be actually be interesting. Obviously, as I say, it's the heritage side where any person can have their dreams invaded, or if you need to be magically attuned or whatever you want to say. That's a question, but no, I could see that. If their first men had their own magicians and sorcerers or shamans who had magical potential or whatever, then they might have been vulnerable to something like that.
Another example of this is when we see one thing we've talked about a lot is the sort of parallelism that goes along in a lot of the forms of magic that exist in this world. There's versions of prophecy that seem to be fire magic oriented, and there's versions of looking into the future that seem to come from the old god / ice side. There's there's raising dead and there's resurrections. There's lots of examples of this. The parallel here would, I suppose, be what we learn about glass candles and being told that they can be used to enter someone's mind or to send messages from far away. And there's a lot of theories out there that might be what's happening with Dany, which is why she keeps seeing Quaithe and things like that. So certainly it's set up if that's what we're really seeing with all that. The mechanism has sort of been established that entering dreams is possible. We don't necessarily understand all the circumstances. Bran and Dany are both very magical people, so like you said, it might be an attunement thing. For example, in H.P. Lovecraft, what he does is he says that when there's like Cthulhu is sending out like evil thoughts out into the world, the sensitive people pick them up in their dreams. It doesn't, not everyone has these dreams, but the artists and the dreamers, the people of a certain disposition. So in this setting, it would be, you could go a little farther with that and say like I like your phrase, magical attunement. That's a good word for it. So that would be like an existential threat. Just they can get in our dreams. They can steal our animals. So that would probably drive them to be pretty vicious, to be like, wow, we really need to kill these beings because they're so dangerous. They're such a threat to us. On the other hand, we keep coming back to this thing about trade. Let's move on to a little discussion of this. We've got another quote from Maester Aemon, or referencing Maester Aemon anyway.
The archives of the Citadel contain a letter from Maester Aemon sent in the early years of the reign of Aegon V, which reports on such an account from a ranger named Redwyn, written in the days of King Doran Stark. It recounts a journey to Lorne Point and the Frozen Shore, in which it is claimed that the ranger and his companions fought giants and traded with the children of the forest. Aemon's letter claims that he had found many such accounts in his examinations of the archives at the Watch at Castle Black, and considered them credible.
So, Elio, what about Maester Aemon? As far as, like you said, you used some of Maester Lewin's stuff. Was Maester Aemon a big part of your consideration, or at least how did he factor in here?
Sure. I mean, we pulled in because of my work on the concordance. I kind of knew where all this stuff was, so that a big part of it was pulling together all the historical things, all the references, and so actually, like the first outline of the world book, of the world book as published, was basically each section was just filled with sections of the concordance to have all the notes in one place, and I would use that to kind of guide of how to shape it, and places where there'd be gaps or places where we could fill in or ask George to fill in something. But so yeah, Samuel's stuff in the Clash of Kings, mentioning that was absolutely a part of it. We absolutely mined things from that.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was fun to kind of do things that way and kind of find where we could kind of just lay things together in one place, in this makes perspective, but organized in a similar way as the concordance is, to make it more useful to people, but at the same time, kind of give a shape to the whole project.
Right on. And as yeah, go ahead, Sean.
I was just going to say one way. It's pretty easy in my mind to reconcile the idea that there would have been conflict with the children and also trade with the children. Just one, the children and the first men weren't homogenous. I assume there's got to be many factions and cultures within the children across the whole continent, different
continentation. That's
terrains. Continentation, yeah. I mean, even like you can imagine. We even know. Remember we did the little interview with Michael Klarfeld's class in Germany.
Yeah.
And they just had this idea that Americans all have guns.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of Americans have guns, but not all of them,
Yeah.
So
quite a few don't.
And the farther you get from it, the more homogenized it's going to become, right? The more, I mean, we think of, I think we're a little better now, but for a long time, it was just the Indians, right?
Yes.
As Native Americans. But we know now there's such a huge difference between the Sioux and the Comanche, and even within the Sioux, there's different factions and beliefs and on and on and on. So, and again, like I said earlier, you can imagine a wave of first men come across. There's some conflict. It's communicated to them, hey, don't chop down his werewood trees. They stop. Then a new wave of first men come, and they might even been warned, hey, don't chop down. It's just, whatever, we're going north. We're going to do what we want. And so those two factions, if you will, first men might be in conflict. One faction of children might start attacking the new first men, where another faction says, no, it's not their fault. But all those detailed histories and subtleties are going to be lost, right, in history. Even though one group might have been trading with the children and might have continued an alliance for 1,000 years, but it's hard to know how all the details have played that out. We don't have histories of it, but you got to assume there's got to be more to it than the little bits that we know. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well point, Sean. Well point. So yeah, and it's funny. Nina brings up the note here that Sam mentions this reference in the Clash of Kings, which he pointed out. I wanted to be clear on that. And he's of course lovingly, he's like, this is such a great thing. This book is so valuable. I mean, heck, that's how I would treat it too. I'm sure you guys probably would too. Like this is an invaluable treasure. But it's neat to think about how this came about. Like, this is a more recent thing, obviously, this account of someone named Redwyn. We don't know how long ago it was, but it could be quite a while ago. It could be 1,000 years ago, but it certainly wasn't 12,000 years ago. It wasn't before. It wasn't this era that we're talking about. So it's possible that the trading between the children and humanity took a lot longer to develop, but maybe not.
I admit, I imagine that account is a post-pact account.
Yeah.
When the relations are a lot better between men and I mean, certainly we have obviously that it's the Night's Watch is established as post Long Night. So I that's my take on it.
Right on.
But I couldn't say when. I know one of the questions is about like when Dorne lived. I can say that George's family tree for the Starks doesn't go, at least what he's shared with us, doesn't go past Torfin.
Yeah.
The king who now. So he did not bother. So all those kings that get mentioned from further back are only George has a good sense, if any sense, of where they fit together. I think he often throws out cool names and cool bits of history, and he doesn't. I'll figure out when I need to. Where they fit into the timeline.
Yeah, if he's just tossing it into a stack of unexplored Starks, he doesn't have to worry about it too much. Once he gets into an area where he's defined more, then he has to be a little more cautious. Like you can't just casually add a Targaryen at this point. Like that's not. But you can make an ancient Stark, no problem. So also,
I imagine that's it.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I imagine it's a challenge for George to discipline his thoughts, to not let himself go off too much on one character or time period when he's trying to focus on a different one. I mean, that's got to be maybe a general writing challenge to keep the right focus.
Well, that's a great pivot, actually, Sean, because Elio, from interviews we've read, he did kind of just, at some points, like without the restraints of characters and the themes that he had been working with, in this, he was able to just kind of go off and just. You kind of get the impression that some of this was really built up and he was really ready to let it all out, or would you frame it differently, or what do you think?
Like I mean, he's had Targaryen family trees for decades before Fire and Blood. I mean, the first one we saw was, I think we told people like it's like 2001 or something. I think is the first one we saw. But George had said like I had just finished it, and it's fairly similar, but there's some distinct differences from the final. And even between the Royals of Fire and Fire and Blood, there are some changes. George changed up Jaehaerys's children a bit, and
True.
So, but a lot of it was he said, I mean, Paris told us we were in London, and George would sometimes like toss and turn in his sleep, and as soon as he woke up, he'd go off to the office to start writing because he was just stuck on creating this stuff for the Royals and Fire. Like it was really the piece he wrote at was this. We would start waking up at like because he would send stuff off to us and Anne in the evening in New Mexico, so 9-10 o'clock, and for us that's like 5 a.m. So we started getting up at 5 a.m. just to see like what new from George.
It's like Christmas every morning,
and like and almost. I mean, there were periods where it was almost daily something new from him. He was on a tear, and it was a lot. It was like when it was. It's clear, obviously, this is easier material to create.
Yeah.
It flows more freely because you don't have to. As you say, you don't have to have characters, you don't have to have dialogue going on, and he just had all this creativity and all this that came out, and it was really cool to see.
That's
and
awesome.
I mean, and it's really, I mean, people may say, oh, it distracted him, but at the same time, I think it kind of allowed him to kind of unblock some aspects of writing in the world because he still loves the world, he loves the setting that he's created, he loves the stories that are possible in it.
It's laying a foundation for him to write more.
Yeah. And as much as we've paid attention to it, and of course we're not the only ones, lots of people have noticed things like this. He seems to love and if some of this comes, maybe relates to the Wheel of Time novels, but as well, just in general, as a real world truism of sorts that history repeats itself. George likes to work out seemingly some of what's going to be worked out in the plot in the main series with historical events sometimes. Like there's hearkenings or similar events or events that have very strong parallels to modern events, like
the Great Council.
Yes,
something
the Great
that we
Council.
maybe didn't know was going to be quite so relevant at the time.
Right. Or, for example, the notion of dragon seeds is introduced in during the Dance of the Dragons, and that's a really big deal. And there's no current dragon seeds that's called by name in the current story, but there's certainly people that might end up riding a dragon that term could apply to them, even whether or not it gets used or not. So it seems like that when you refer to him getting unblocked, I think that sounds right to me. It feels intuitively accurate, as well as, especially when we frame it in this with this idea of him working through what might happen in the book later. So that's really neat. I like that a lot. I also want to jump back to something you said, Sean, or that we were talking about with the homogenization and viewing people as a group. That's happening right now with the First Men, as we discuss them. The First Men are not just one ethnicity. They're called that as a shortcut because nobody knows better. Nobody knows what ethnicities they used to have, like what land, what part of Essos they came from would have had some part of defining who they were, but that's all lost. So First Men is a catch-all phrase. Super important to remember that. It's not one ethnicity. It's not one culture. It's just called that because we don't know better. And the End-All sort of framed it that way later, I guess more so than anybody else. Does Elliot have anything to add to that, or is that pretty much how you see it too?
No, I think that's really how I see it. I was thinking a little bit about the example of where he was thinking about the first generation and the next generation, being warned about it, the next wave being warned. I was thinking about the American frontier, where you had like the earliest people to explore the frontier, trappers and scouts, who formed out of necessity more positive relationships, or sort of the more careful relationships with the Native Americans, trying to tell the people, homesteaders and people coming behind them, how to respect, don't go over to this. That's a sacred site. That's a burial place, and them being scoffed at, and them saying, we've got we've got our caravan wagon, our caravan of wagons. We got our guns. We don't have to care what the engines have to say about it. And that fomenting so much trouble. And it's very easy to imagine that the people who would come after wouldn't have the experience of interacting with them, and so they would just form they'd have a completely different baseline of knowledge on which to interact. And it's one thing to be told something; it's quite another to actually experience it and discover it on your own.
It's also worth noting they would have different, I don't know how to say this, demands. I guess like a lone trapper or even two guys going down a riverside, just trying to scrape enough food together for themselves. It's different than two families building houses.
Yeah,
right.
Good point. Yeah.
They're going to chop down more trees to make the houses and cook fires.
More mouths to
They're
feed.
going to spread out more land and gardens. They're just more likely to have an impact, even if they aren't necessarily trying to be malicious. They just might, and when you get more and more of them, they're just more and more going to encroach on the land and use up more resources, even if they're attempting to respect the natives' land or traditions or whatever. It's more difficult for them to, and at a certain point, they might feel like, we can't. What else are we supposed to do? We're going to let our children starve or freeze to death rather than cut down these trees? We're cutting down these trees.
Yeah.
And then natives attack them. So then they fight back to defend themselves. And no one feels like they're in the wrong, even if someone is more or less in the wrong. But they're all fundamentally in those early stages just trying to survive.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Actually, one aspect is, when they discuss what the first men brought with them, it's cattle, it's horses. They need pasture, and they brought agriculture. They need fields. And if you look at the early history of agriculture, even agriculture today, it's a lot of slash and burn. You burn down forests to make places so you can start farming. So that would have been a huge shock, I think, to children. Obviously, like, why would you destroy our forests, especially when we're living in it?
Yeah.
Just to, learn to do like what we do. We just hunt and live off the land, and that's enough. Why do you need more? Why do you need to have these fields of grains, and why do you need to have these animals and pent up?
And why do you need to make so many of yourselves? That was another thing, right? There's so many more humans than children, right? That's really, really well said. Good said. The idea that this notion of the early trappers being the first point of contact is really fascinating to me. That was a really good idea to raise, because also they live more similarly. Like Sean points out, the settlers that come behind, they're not only are they doing things very differently, like you said, they have different demands. The trappers, the other side of the coin is the trappers are living a similar lifestyle. The children hunted and gathered. So a trapper is basically a hunter and gatherer. So they live a similar lifestyle. That's at least something to find common ground on. Like, hey, I also kill animals to eat them and wear their skins. Hey, so do I. That's something. It's definitely something. And from that something is where they start trading and start figuring out basic ways of communication, and then presumably over very long periods of time, that advances. The children are maybe better at holding on to that knowledge because of the way their collective intelligence sort of works, or maybe kind of works. We're not fully clear on that. And their longer lifespan, so that you're dealing with
another thing.
Experience.
Elio, I think you asked almost rhetorically, the children would be like, why do you need these fields? Why don't you do it like us? And especially for the children who have these, supernatural abilities to communicate with each other or whatever. They have longer lifespans and so on. They wouldn't want or need some things that these new people would, like a ship to sail back home, or a more stable stock of food, grain and supply, something like that. So, and at some point, some of the things that the first men or whoever coming into contact with children, they would have some things that children would recognize, like, oh, actually, that's a pretty useful tool, or that's a pretty clever idea. That there would be exchanges, of goods and services and knowledge, even if the one race is quote unquote more superior. But and that might be the need for if you want to think of the first men as being inferior in certain ways, needing all these resources, but they don't have these supernatural powers. They're trying to find ways to make up for it. So
yeah, that's well said. Yeah. It's I think I may have mentioned this before, but I remember hearing just other examples of how Native Americans were just flummoxed at some of the beliefs that settlers had, and vice versa. But one good example is gold. Native Americans didn't give a crap about gold, except maybe in a few exceptions. But for the most part, it didn't matter to them, and they had a name for it, which translated roughly to the yellow metal that makes white people crazy. I was like, that's okay. That's pretty accurate, I guess. It's a pretty accurate description. And then, for example, there's a story I think from Hardcore History where I think a soldier's payment train was captured. So it's just paper money, though. And the natives didn't care about paper money, even though they could take that money and go spend it. They could actually use it. They could have taken it and spent it in like American towns. They just gave it to the kids to play with, and they were folding it and throwing it in the river and stuff like that. So, yeah, I mean,
I guess they didn't know to make paper airplanes.
See, yeah, good point. Good point, right? Somebody needed to invent airplanes for them to have paper airplanes. So yeah, as I think about things like that, folks, there's countless examples of cultures coming together that never seen each other. Oh, another good example, in South America, where the Spanish conquistadors, they brought horses, and the natives there had never seen a horse before. And there's similar stories of this, like in ancient Greece, where people thought the first time they ever saw someone riding a horse, they thought they were a centaur, things like that. So, it's really hard to reset your brain to this point of not knowing things to try to have the perspective of these ancients.
It almost seems silly to us because we know so well, but to them, if you can like imagine yourself in a more quote unquote ignorant state, what would you think?
Yeah.
What would you? It makes sense to think that when you don't have the knowledge base that we have now.
Have you all seen Apocalyptica?
Yeah, I think I did see that.
Apocalypto. Sorry, Apocalyptica is the band. That's like Metallica. They're like the cellists playing Metallica.
Classical instruments, right?
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Apocalypto. Yeah. So the end there, the settler ships or they're just like, what the heck is that? Their ship's just coming, and they're like, they've never seen a ship before, and they just stare at it like, what? That's kind of how I think. Like if we ever saw a dragon, that's what we'd be like. Be like, what? Let's hope that doesn't actually happen, though. I don't want to see a dragon.
That film's interesting. I know, but that film gets obviously stick from people, but it's a fantasy of the sort of Mesoamerican. But what I find is like if you put yourself in the perspective of the characters, like everything that's happening in the world makes sense to them. From the European perspective, it's just completely bizarre. The sacrifices, tear people's heart out, all of that. None of that makes sense. On the other hand, from the perspective, what's coming, it makes no sense to them. These tall, bearded people coming off these great wooden boats.
It's like how the Dothraki look at it.
Yeah, it's such a. There must have been a complete kind of this confusion from the first contact between the children and the first men. It's like they're so different. It's like a first contact. It's like a Star Trek kind of thing.
Oh yeah, Star Trek. That's perfect.
Yeah,
On the other hand, we should perhaps consider, given the Greenseers' abilities, maybe they foresaw it. Maybe they had some idea it was coming. Now, they wouldn't necessarily be able to predict the exact interactions. I don't know that green dreams are so crystal clear that they would be able to see things in such clarity, but they may have seen something. They may have seen these images, these faces, these beings, and them crossing or them chopping down the trees, or I don't know, they might have had some bad dreams before, something like that. So that's another really interesting idea, something to consider, given that dreams and are such a big part of their existence. Maybe they saw some of it coming. I don't know. Then again, if they did, then why didn't they break the arm earlier? I guess that could be maybe because they didn't break the arm at all. It's possible, but we'll get to that in a minute. We'll get to the broken arm. Let's talk a little bit about how some of these concepts apply to Dorne specifically. We talked about being careful about amalgamating a race or a group of races that we don't know the breakdown of. But of course, when cultures come from one place and they exist in a new place long enough, at some point they become a new culture. They may have that distant ancestry. Their DNA, if it were possible to measure it, would still contain evidence of where they originated from. But culturally, they would have evolved into something new. And in Dorne, well, that's a pretty interesting story all in itself. So let's start with some quotes and then work our way into that topic.
I got this one. The Dornish men boast that theirs is the oldest of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros. This is true, after a fashion. Unlike the Andals, who came later, the first men were not seafarers. They came to Westeros not on longships, but afoot, over the land bridge from Essos, the remnants of which exist today only as the stepstones and the broken arm of Dorne. Walking or riding, the eastern shores of Dorne would inevitably have been where they first set foot upon Westerosi soil.
One of the most interesting houses in all of not just Dorne, but all of Westeros is House Dayne. They're one of the most interesting, most compelling, and they might have one of the most ancient lineages. At least when you see them, the name thrown around, you often hear houses talking about, our house goes back to the Age of Heroes. You hear the term 8,000 years thrown around. With the Danes, occasionally you see it as high as 10,000 years. And this whole legend of them, the founder following a fallen star to the site of where the castle was built. Elio, how do you imagine that? Do you think of that as like they followed all the way across the land bridge all the way there, or were they already settled in Dorne? I mean, I know we're not going to have a clear answer, but just when you think about it, like what kind of comes in your head?
Interesting. I admit I because it's so kind of. I mean, the 10,000 specific number comes from Darkstar, I believe, when he says that and 10,000 is this kind of thing that George often uses. Characters is a many years ago. So his 10,000 could be rounding. It could be 7,000. It could be 8,000. It's just for effect. I have my own notions about the Danes, so.
Feel free.
And they're just my theories about them, but that they may not quite be the same as the other first men.
Yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to put them first, because they have differences.
Yeah. Because I keep thinking about the Old Town, where George introduced the idea that the lowest levels of the High Tower are this black stone.
Yeah. What's going on there? Yeah, because folks, if in case it's not clear, we've explained this before, but some of y'all may not have heard it. The Danes have purple eyes. So for at least a lot of them do. We're not clear on if it's probably not 100% of them anyway. Point being, for a long time in the fandom, people thought there was some sort of connection to the Targaryens, or at least to Valyria. But George was explicit, right? That if there is a connection, it's super ancient if there's any connection at all. So they have purple eyes for some other reason. It's not related to that. But that in itself is an interesting genetic marker that sort of separates them, because who else has purple eyes? If it's not, besides the ones who are explicitly by George not connected to them, well, nobody. No one else has purple eyes except for them that we know of. No. So.
And there's the other bit where we've asked about Dawn, the sword of the Danes, and how old is it? And he said, well, it's a couple thousand years old at least, and then beyond that things start getting fuzzy. Mm-hmm. So he's obviously holding his cards, I think, for a bit. At the same time, he's being realistic about it. I mean, if you had a artifact that was genuinely many thousands of years old, like if today some of them came out and said, here, I've got the sword of Gilgamesh, people would probably argue about what exactly is it. Is it that? How old would it actually be? There's all sorts of different over the course of modern history. There's been a lot of different timelines for when various things happened, when various people existed. It's an interesting one. And one aspect of this is we mentioned Maester Lu, and his history was our first basis for what Yandel kind of shares his timeline that he provides. I mean, of roughly of the age of it. He occasionally mentions other guesses, like how old the world is or whatever, but George later started to get a bit fuzzier on the numbers, especially for ancient things. And we brought it up with him, like, why did numbers start getting fuzzier, like later, like when when Samwell goes on about how the timeline for the number of Lord Commanders
Yeah.
of Night's Watch is kind of weird, and there's some kind of break. We say 999th commander, but I found this, and it would say, and he stops. We don't hear exactly.
John interrupts
and
him. We're mad at John
said,
for that.
yeah, well, and George said, well, that's because of you and fans like you who kept asking me about trying to pin down all these things. So he stopped, and also pointed out mistakes. So he stopped being quite so precise, so it's easier for him not to, make errors. So,
oh, that's hilarious.
yeah,
I brought that up one time, that I don't know, discrepancy, if you will.
You did, Sean.
Just the idea that it's likely that certain ages would be exaggerated. Right?
Mhm.
If there were any holes or gaps or opportunities for someone to claim the Night's Watch was older than it was, of course they would do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like any house wants to be, 2,000 years old, not 1,300 years old. There's a certain prestige that comes with age, a certain mystique and honor and etc. So it makes sense for numbers to get fudged and rounded. And
you're totally
you
right.
see this in history. I mean, you just look at the Bible. The Bible has, in the Old Testament, has people living hundreds of years to try and create this lineage. And then you have, more recently, the Vikings. There's the sort of the Nordic kings, the Norse kings, had these legendary lineages that would, after like 5 or 6 generations, start getting very fuzzy. And then we were descended from Odin, who was the father of our line. So the gods appears. And so history. One of the things that I wish George paid more attention to was more kind of how were these things recorded. I mean, we have like the Septons recorded, the oral histories, but there are runes, there are rune stones. The first men probably would have left monumental items with something. That one of the things we have is Yandel refers to studies of this sort of thing, and maesters who've tried to catalog the barrow mounds in the north and things of that sort. But that's one area where I felt I could fill in the gap a little bit. And there are maesters paying attention to this stuff and trying to figure it out. It's probably not going to come out in the books, but there is an effort. I'm sure there's probably competing timelines. This is even now there's some very crazy alternative timelines to our world history.
Yeah.
There's a Russian fellow who came with a very, very different timeline to things. And obviously there's the creationist timeline, which is very different as well
it's
from
pretty
the
different,
scientific timeline.
That is very true. Yeah, just reading about the history of history, you see that's one of the things that maybe gets lost in the shuffle. You see people used to believe it was this, and then they used to believe it was this, and they used to believe it was this. So we have had different phases of belief.
And most of them are based on new information coming to light, new archaeological or carbon dating or whatever.
Sometimes
else
it's cultural or religious shifts, but yeah, you're right. A lot of times it's especially now with the technology, it's just opening so many things up. Yeah.
A lot of times too, even now, when scientists, our modern day maesters sometimes make some new realization, but it isn't immediately disseminated. Even with the internet, it still isn't immediately disseminated to everyone. It still might take a couple years for it to become part of school curriculums or whatever. And even just, when we were in high school, what we were learning in high school might be a generation old as far as information on, quantum physics or the Big Bang Theory or something like that.
Sure, yeah.
So imagine in this time, there may be some maester who has tracked down a more realistic timeline, but even everyone in the Citadel isn't even aware of it, much less everyone in the world. So another thought that I had, by the way, especially thinking of potential alternate origins of Dayne, compared to like our real world history, there is a thought that some early settlers of the Americas came maybe before or independently of the Bering Strait. They think that there's good evidence they may have sailed across to South America.
I was
the islands,
the
Philippines, Polynesian islands were all being settled by seafarers, but it would be long lost because the sea level's risen like 100 meters since then.
Yeah.
So any kind of
their settlements would have been on the coast.
Settlements along the South American coast are just buried in the ocean for thousands of years. So we can't. It's a good supposition to make, but we have no evidence for it really.
Yeah, it's
what
like
are
we
you
have.
still doing here then, Sean? Why aren't you on the South American
get
coast,
in there, man.
getting in the
Get
water?
in there. Yeah, it's like caves are
but
more
it could be
contained,
something like
or
that
deserts are more.
with Dayne, right? They may have come in some earlier wave that may have been lost in rising sea levels or whatever else.
Yeah, that's true because maybe we'll get into this a little bit later, but you're right. Like it's not said in Westeros this happened, but in the real world, the Bering Strait was passable. Then it wasn't. Then it was. Then it wasn't. And now it's not. And it may, like, in thousands of years, become passable again on foot. Maybe not, but these things go in phases. So it's possible, like you're saying, it's also possible that the arm was partially crossed. But there's another theory that a large population lived on the bridge and was stuck there for a while due to, like, kind of being glaciers on either side. And then, so they had like a microcosm of evolution there. But yeah, it's super, super fascinating.
I just want to bring up a little thing. We're bringing up House Dayne. I learned something new when I was getting ready for this episode. I did not realize that the House Dayne sigil at one point was a 7-pointed star, and that y'all had that fixed to be a 5-pointed star. Just little things like that. Yeah.
That's pretty cool. What was the? That was just.
Yeah.
What's the story behind that?
Well, that was when George was writing A Feast for Crows. He told us that he had come up with these militant orders, stars and the swords, and he decided that he wanted the 7-pointed star to be something that was used primarily by families that had the connections to, like, particular connections to the faith, or who had members who were, family had some association with the stars or the swords. So we went through all the houses that had stars at that point, and he decided which of them would keep having a 7-pointed star and which of them would not. And Dayne was one that he decided, that their sigil was, predates the Yandels, and so it doesn't make sense for theirs to be 7-pointed.
Cool. Okay. Well, that makes sense.
Real quick, I doubt you have an exact number, but I'm just curious about how many houses have a star as part of their sigil. Is it like 7 or 38?
7 would be appropriate.
I'd want to say there's at least half a dozen.
Okay.
Templeton, Sunglass, Dayne,
Tarbeck, but they're gone now.
Tarbeck, yeah. Well, and Tarbeck, obviously, that one he kept 7. He really liked how that one came out when we did our take on it.
Oh, cool.
He thought that was he so much so that he said that he was ashamed that he had killed them all already.
That's funny. Okay, well, let's take a quick break. We'll do some mid-roll business. We've got a few questions from folks, as well as a couple shout-outs, and then we'll get back to Dorne and other interesting questions surrounding Dorne. Even if you're one of those people who is good at coming up with gift ideas, you can never really have too many, because let's be honest, anyone you're getting a gift for, you're probably getting gifts for regularly or semi-regularly, right? So let me suggest givehergifts.com. A package from givehergifts.com is an excellent idea. GIVHER gifts. There's no E in give. These gifts are different than the rest because it is an experience that you and your partner can do together. It's about connection. Aaron, the owner, started givehergifts.com recently. It's a small business, independently owned. A lot of people really prefer when their gifts come from indie stores instead of the Goliath companies. It's kind of nice. It makes it feel a little more personal. We got a sample package here. It's a combination of romantic, useful, and quirky. I'm particularly into this beeswax candle because it says queenly romances on it. In A Song of Ice and Fire, we see beeswax candles in fancy places and used as sealing wax, so this fits pretty nicely. Many generations of Lady Beesberries would be all over this, I'm quite sure. They would certainly approve of this and the rest of the package because this is just one of the items. I'm actually going to light this so the rest of our studio smells like beeswax for the rest of this episode.
You're going to light it.
I'm going to light it, so we're going to have a nice candlelit podcast for the rest of our time here today.
Whoa,
Look
fire!
at that.
That's the first time we've ever had fire, I think.
That's
on our
a
stream.
big candle. These matches also came in the package, so this is nice. All right, so I'm gonna be smelling like beeswax the rest of this podcast.
That's
So
none
give
of my
her gifts.
beeswax.
GIVHER gifts.com. Get 10% off with the code Westeros, and the link is down in the description. Check it out. Okay, moving on. We have. Boy, that smells really good.
It hasn't reached me yet. Quite.
Yeah, soon it will. Okay, so let's take a couple questions here. The Toss Generation says, this is referring to the Dragonbone content discussion we had in a prior episode. Toss Generation says, speaking to the iron content in Dragonbones tangent in this episode, iron, Fe, can be a devalent cation? Oh, they're using science terms that I don't recognize. Fe2 plus and can be coordinated by phosphate similar to devalent calcium, Ca2 plus, which forms calcium phosphate. This is the main mineral found in bones and teeth to reinforce. So in other words, they're saying it's plausible. So that's kind of neat. Good to hear some science people weighing in on the Dragonbone question. Anthony.
Oh, I smell it now.
Yeah, it smells good, doesn't it?
Very smoky.
Anthony says, do you guys think the Rhoynish water wizards who taught the native Dornish how to communicate with the rivers were actually just farmers who knew irrigation? The former sounds way cooler, and we know that elemental magic seems to exist, but the latter is just more rational.
This is something I've always struggled with because I really want to think the more rational irrigation thing, but I do think that there's enough stories of their water magic that they did have water magic. I think they used their water magic for advanced irrigation.
I feel like it's probably both. Like it was like, because you hear stories of Rhoynish water wizards like hitting dragons with whirlpools.
Yeah, I'm like,
and
I don't
water
think that's all
spouts.
made up.
Yeah. So, but they probably did have better farming techniques. Like they lived along the river and they existed so much longer. What do you think, Elio?
I'm inclined to believe. I mean, even most Maesters agree that there was more magic in the past, and so I am inclined to believe the accounts, which must come from Valyrian histories of these water wizards, and I guess any surviving Rhoynish histories.
Yeah.
As obviously, there's no water wizards any longer. Of magic has sort of faded away, but at the same time, the text mentions, I mean, the Dornish irrigated along the river banks to supply their farms and their fields. So I think they probably went hand in hand. I suspect a lot of the water wizard work was stuff like dousing for wells and things like that as time passed. But I guess we're supposed to believe that they also were able to make water shoot up out of the rivers, and I'm not sure how that would necessarily be used.
Yeah, other than to take out dragons,
per se. Like unless they're constantly going and constantly working to move water from one place to another. But maybe they would have ways to make it, make it easier for the water to find a path to where you can get it where you want it to be, so that they can then use it for irrigation. It's a good
kind
question.
of encouraged its direction.
I never really talked to George about that one either. No.
Well, it's
Yeah, but I always thought it was like a really interesting thing. Is it's not that long ago that died out.
Yeah.
Like for water magic to disappear, it's just so weird to me that there aren't Dornish that profess to have it, that we just don't see any of it.
Yeah, this isn't thousands of years ago.
I don't get why their magic disappeared. Except that if it was blood related, like they did too much intermarriage in Dorne and the really pureborn Rhoynar, maybe they can still do it. I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe there's not enough water in the desert to maintain their skills.
Ran out of practice.
I mean, or maybe the magic actually lies in the River Rhoyne, and once they left it, I mean, what they could do.
That's why they kept trying to go back.
Yeah.
That's true, yeah.
That's why it might be the most satisfying answer to me, because it is something that has always bothered me. It's just the idea of, like, why did it go away? What are the circumstances here?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, we do
Lots
certainly...
of other magic went away, too. It could all be connected to the same
that's true, but, like, the
source that
Targaryens...
has been suppressed.
Yeah, but still, like, the Targaryens still had their dragon dreams. Like, they still had their magic.
Yeah. It didn't go away entirely.
Yeah, it didn't go away entirely, so you would think maybe there were some Rhoynar, some Dornish who could, make a sprinkle.
Yeah, maybe they're still out there.
They could if there was some water around.
and you are right that just because we haven't seen it doesn't mean that they don't exist. We haven't seen a lot of Dorne. We haven't seen a lot of the Rhoynar,
And one reason this is so relevant right here is because as we build up to the breaking of the arm, well, that's a similar form of magic potentially. It might be an earthquake that shattered the arm, but it might be a raising of the waters, which is a similar kind of manipulation of water, just water associated magic. nature magic, to maybe generalize it a little more. But yeah, it's at least thematically connected in some ways. So that's pretty cool. Hopefully that.
Real quick, I want to
yeah,
ask Elio: are you familiar with Avatar: The Last Airbender?
I know of it. I've never watched it.
Okay.
So I haven't, unfortunately.
So you imagine there are waterbenders.
Yeah, waterbenders. Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
water,
Of course.
earth, air, fire benders in that world.
Yeah.
So something that I can't remember if we even bring it up, but obviously in Essos we hear about the Ifekevron, which is our children of the forest of Essos. Do you have any thoughts on whether you think they were there or they came? Any thoughts on the Ifekevron? It's such like a throwaway thing, but it captured my thoughts so immediately.
They're pretty cool, yeah.
Yeah, I have to imagine that they existed all across, at least Essos and Westeros, and it seems, Essos became had the first people came from there, so it became the first place where civilizations formed, and they must have had their own conflicts, lost to history with the children, until the children seem to have been driven into, if they even exist any longer in the forest any longer, or if that was their last bastion. So yeah, that was something, George. That came up, that one actually, so the Ifekevron first came up separately from the world of Ice and Fire as we know it, because that's the Lands of Ice and Fire project.
Oh yeah, that's right. That was
Yeah.
the first time that it came. I was like, what?
The Land of the Ifekevron. I remember on
Right.
Westeros.org, the people were just like going nuts. Like, what is that? Is that a thing? Is that a people? Is that a person? Like, is that a race? Like, there's so much speculation. That was good times.
Oh, weird. We are all back on. That was never happened to us.
Okay.
That was very
We're back.
Yeah, we're back. That was super weird.
Are we okay? Ben?
Yeah,
we're
we're
good.
good. That was never happened.
I think we only lost like 10 seconds.
Yeah. All right.
Right. I was coming back from London for like a press junket for like season 2 of Game of Thrones or something, and I had my iPad and I was checking my email, and George started sending scans of his maps, and then and each one was included, like he had like a text description of what all this stuff was, which was really cool. And obviously we were very happy to incorporate that into the World of Ice and Fire when we were finishing up, and that's for the ancient history stuff. So yeah, no, that was pretty neat where that came up. And also, I think I recall, he gave a name for them and or the meaning of it, which I can't remember it offhand, but that, he had consulted with David Peterson about with that sort of thing.
Right on.
About what to call it, what the Dothraki would call them.
That's cool.
Yeah, because I also have to wonder. The children are able to communicate with each other far more easily than the average person. So in terms of, were they communicating across, from Westeros to Essos, or those kind of different closed circuit networks, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, I admit I like the idea that there's this, that the weirwoods are this massive, what do we call it, clonal tree form, but it's all connected by roots underground.
Yeah.
That maybe that's necessary for that to work, but yeah, I'm not sure. That's just a theory. I kind of like the idea. There are trees like that are just gigantic clones of themselves. It's kind of a collective group that is all connected together, and they look like separate trees, but they're not. And obviously that ties into other things George has written and so on. So
I talked about this in a past episode, but it's a recent scientific discovery that even different species of trees and plants do have a very coordinated system of sharing resources connected through the roots and fungus underground, that they have tracked dyed water moving from one plant to another, and carbon elements and so on, that there's they don't think it's like this active thought process that the plants have, but it's sort of a evolution of responses that they coordinate. Growing or injured plants get more nitrates or carbon, and they do how many leaves to let grow to let more light through to the lower levels and so on. It's an amazing new growing discovery of how forest systems
Growing
work.
discovery, you say? So back to this, the notion perhaps that all of this was like a Pangea as we had on Earth is a possibility. Now, with such a vast timescale, that doesn't necessarily mean that bipeds existed that long ago. Maybe the children did, but the reason I bring this up now is because of this next question that refers to the possibility that a lot of these races were either closer together or that they're misrepresented, kind of the way the green men are. So it's kind of an open-ended question as to the identification of other species and cultures. So let me read it here. Is there a chance the brindled men and the hairy men and all the other races are just regular people with only slightly different features? In our world, early writings of explorers and imperialists described natives inhabiting other lands as monstrous and beast-like, but we know now that they just had different skin colors and spoke different languages. Those early writers were mostly horrid jerks. But is it possible in the world of Ice and Fire for the Maesters to hold similar prejudices? Perhaps the city of winged men doesn't have winged men, but men who wear feathered cloaks or something like that for some kind of custom, maybe to honor gods, who knows. Yeah. The sentiment is shared with the green men on the Isle of Faces when it's implied that they may simply wear green robes and horn headdresses, and this could be true with the Sothorii too. Well, I can at least answer the easiest part of this. The brindled men and hairy men are well attested. They appear in like the gladiator pits and other places, so they are legitimately different. But when it gets to the winged men and the green men in particular, he's got a point, don't you think, Elio?
Yeah, sure. I mean, once you get past once you go far enough east, it gets extremely. I mean, no Maester has been to the city of winged men. It's just accounts from travelers on the who claim to have heard from someone else, who claimed to have heard from someone who claimed to have been there or something, So yeah, that's whether that even exists is it you have to look at works like Herodotus and Pliny
yes.
for the sort of or Marco Polo's account of there are men with faces in their bellies and things. There's a lot of
nonsense.
Not nonsense, probably. When you go up very far east and on that map of Essos, there's a lot of stuff like it's just like the barest rumors of rumors atop of rumors about those things. So absolutely, as far as Sulfuros and I said the brindled men, we have accounts of those. The hairy men, the hairy men are the sort of these kind of not necessarily prehistoric, but they involved in sort of a classical period of conflicts, as I recall, in Essos, not necessarily from Sulfuros. And I had imagined them being. I think there's suggestions they might be related to the men of Ib.
Yeah.
And
or the
Maesters have definitely have their views on their understandings of that. Where I think Yandel talks about them as they can't breed with humans, or they do for their mules. They're not able to procreate. But then obviously we have the claim from Ben Plum that he's descended from. He's part Tibonese,
yeah.
So that calls into question that whole thing. And Yandel doesn't know. He's going off the general sort of received wisdom among the Maesters about that thing. I think there's definitely different groups. There are definitely different subspecies of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
I think like the Ibonese, the way George describes them, they sound a little bit like he said they're kind of Neanderthals who kind of have continued to exist.
Yeah.
But there's a small amount of Neanderthal DNA in all of us.
Yeah.
So
True that.
Yeah.
or
Some more than others.
All of us, I think. Most of us, at least in Europe, anyone from Europe has a little bit of Neanderthal DNA.
Yeah, we did. We talked about that in our Giants episode. It's really fascinating to go back that far, and some of these things ring true. It's pretty clear that George has at least a better than a decent idea of a lot of. He's very well read and understands history. He may not be, an expert on ancient history or prehistory, but he knows his stuff.
If I may, Aziz, a couple of these topics we just hit on segue to a question I had.
Go for it.
Elio, you may have some insight into this. I wonder if there is an inspiration for Dorne by Afghanistan. I realize how many parallels there are, that the word Afghan, the origins of that word roughly translate to cavalry or horse breeder. And we know that's the steeds of Dorne are, I don't know, part of its identity. And they're both very mountainous, desertous terrains.
Yeah.
Afghanistan is one of the most ancient civilizations in the world, and also one of the least urbanized civilizations. It doesn't have very many large cities. The Silk Road ran through Afghanistan, which would have been like trade routes, and would have mixed a lot of different cultures, and a sort of a bridge between the continents. It's been resistant to occupation. It's thrice fought off the British and in the Soviets and in the U.S. And I don't know if that's all just coincidence. If that was in George's mind somewhere, he would have been a witness to the Soviets in Afghanistan. And
I think there's a little bit of it. I mean, anything that he creates is a melange of various inspirations. I mean, it also has a bit of the Moorish Spain, with the sort of the confluence of different cultures and the sort of the differences there. The part that I always think that was inspired by Afghanistan a little bit was Alexander the Great's campaigns there, particularly in Bactria, where with the young dragon, with the whole thing where they, the young dragon used the goat track to, get past the Dornish watchtowers, and there's this whole account of Alexander sending men climbing up a cliff face to surprise the Bactrians. So that's kind of thing I think certainly has some influence. George has he's read popular histories and things of that kind, and at the same time Crusader histories, the Horns of Hattin, and the challenges of the Crusaders trying to hold on to their state, or when they're in this desert community, Richard the Lionhearted being there, and what he did. All of those things I think are an influence. I think George would name Afghan first, but it has to be in the mix.
Right on. Well said. Yeah, I think of Alexander and as well.
For reference, Sean, other places that come up when thinking of Dorne are obviously, we mentioned more Spain, but there's, Wales is often brought up. Even India a bit. But yeah, definitely Afghanistan, the Middle East in general, I think it is in the mix there.
At first, when I was, watching a show and reading the books, I was equating it to Spain or maybe even Egypt, northern Africa,
especially considering it was filmed there.
Right. But then when I'm starting to read The World of Ice and Fire and learning more about the history of Dorne and its resistance to Targaryens, I started thinking how similar it was to Afghanistan. So anyway.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Another comment here. It's okay to have an affair with Oberyn because he doesn't kiss and Martell. Actually accidentally wrote kill and Martell in the document here.
Yeah, I was wondering what that meant.
That's true also. He does kill and tell. Or he did anyway. So we mentioned a lot of the different places to find you and different projects you've been a part of, different major areas in the community that you have been a part of creating. But we didn't mention your YouTube channel, Elio. You guys have a YouTube channel as well with a lot of good stuff over there. Why don't you give us a minute on that real quick?
Well, it's a very dormant channel at the moment, but we were doing things discussing. I don't know why we started doing it. We just thought it would be fun to start talking about various topics about the setting, theories, ideas, characters, and then when the TV show came out, we started to do sort of reviews, discussions of the series as episode by episode. Well, I stopped at the end of season 5. Continued on with it as she could, and it's been very dormant. We've been talking about getting back into it. We just got a new camera last week,
nice.
But I've been waiting to get finally, and to kind of up the quality of it, and probably for House of the Dragon. We're a little conflicted about how to. We're probably not going to review House of the Dragon. I mean, House of the Dragon is based on Fire and Blood, and all that material that it's based on was written for our book. So we feel like it'd be a little odd for us to comment on it in a sort of a review way, but we might discuss it just like, this is the history in the book, and this is the history as they present it, and it's showing the differences and the details and what's the same, what's different. We might do that.
That sounds
We
good.
haven't fully decided, but
Okay.
that sounds like an approach we'll take.
Right on. That sounds good.
To it.
Yeah, and of course,
Talk about having expectations, by the way.
and the channel's just called Westeros. Super easy to find.
Yeah, I put it in the
Yeah.
chat description for
Great.
all
Okay.
as
Yeah, it's
well.
got y'all's Westeros .org logo. Very easy to recognize.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about the formation of some of the. We talked about King Daeron. That's appropriate because he is one of the main sources on some of this stuff. Let's start with, that one right there.
Most of the first men who chose to remain in Dorne, instead of wandering north in search of sweeter lands, settled close to the banks of the Greenblood, digging canals and ditches to bring its life-giving waters to the trees and crops they planted. Others preferred to dwell beside the narrow sea. The eastern shores of Dorne are more forgiving than the southern, and soon many small villages arose, sustaining themselves on fish and crabs. The more restless of the first men pushed onward and made homes for themselves in the foothills south of the Red Mountains, where storms moving north were wont to drop their moisture, creating a fertile green belt. Those who climbed farther took refuge amongst the peaks, in hidden valleys and high mountain meadows, where the grass was green and sweet. Only the bravest and the maddest dared to strike out inland across the deep sands. A few of these found water amongst the dunes and raised holdfasts and castles on those oases. Their descendants, centuries later, became the lords of the wells. But for every man who stumbled on a well, 100 must surely have died of thirst beneath the blazing Dornish sun.
Yikes. So you see sort of the formation of these new ethnic groups or new cultural groups. I guess that's both true. They're both ethnic and culturally distinct. They may have come from a common origin, but that origin is long lost to the mysteries of time, or the mists of time rather. And as we are all somewhat products of our environment, these very different environments, high mountains, deserts, etc., have created differences within these groups. So, of course, that's where we get salty, sandy, and stony, right? So the classifications that were made by Daeron. Now, Daeron's the original source for that, or was he carrying that forward from someone else?
We're told
remember.
that he is the originator of that term.
Right on. Okay.
I don't necessarily doubt it. I imagine others must have had some other. There must have been a recognition that there were these three distinct, sort of geographically determined groupings of Dornish, and especially by Daeron's time when the Rhoynar had been there for hundreds of years, and particularly impacting along the coast. So there must have been something, or technically four groups. Obviously, we have the orphans as well, who
Oh,
are
yeah, of course.
a bit apart. But those three main bodies of them, yes, absolutely. The actual term seemed to be Daeron, but I can't imagine it was a new thought that there were these three groups of people.
Yeah, they're such simple names. I mean, Stony, Salty, and Sandy. They're not like these fancy new terms or something. So yeah, and it does make a lot of sense. You're right. It would be kind of odd if no one had ever noticed or categorized that before. It's kind of hard to believe. So, but he, of course, it also makes sense that a famous figure like a king writing a book is already kind of unusual, especially someone at his age. But it would also be, because the king wrote the book, it's going to immediately be more popular and widespread than some other text. Of course, we must remember that it's not like these things are mass printed. So, the king's word is going to carry a lot of extra weight, even though his life was short. So you wonder, I mean, it's mentioned in the books that he exaggerated some of the danger of some of the difficulty of his conquest, but there's not much reason to believe he exaggerated the stuff about ethnicities, right? I wouldn't see a reason to do that. There's not much incentive.
I mean, we see it. I mean, it seems pretty clear that just in the sense of the histories of these different groups and why they have different appearances. For example, with the Rhoynish blood being most obvious among the salty, and those from the mountains, the Stony Dornishmen having the most Andal blood, so you get fairer people, ruddier skinned people. It fits the descriptions of the characters that we get in the books. and just makes sense that way. So that part seems to be accurate enough. And I mean, and George made a distinction. He talked about how, for example, we asked him with the heraldry of like the Blackmonts and the Manwoodies, like why do they have such sort of wicked,
aggressive, violent,
barbaric heraldry of crowned skulls and vultures grabbing babies, and I mean, so that the Mountain Dornish were particularly involved in long-standing history of raiding and sort of counter raids and feuding with the Marchers. So there's that cultural difference as well, in that they have that history, and they're on the leading edge of contact with the rest of Westeros, and the Marcher Lords to reach the Stormlands, and they were the first line of defense. So they have as a particular martial history compared to say the salty Dornishmen, who perhaps had fewer issues with that kind of conflict. They probably had more conflicts among themselves and the like,
because they live so far away from the borders of the other regions. If you like, they're living on the shores, they're extremely far from the Reach and the Stormlands,
and because of the Dornish coast not being especially suitable for naval operations, or try to invade by sea, so for the most part people would have to come over the mountains. And besides that, I was thinking about the fact that and we also think, I mean, for prior to Nymeria, Dorne was divided into all these petty kingdoms. So it's not like you have one kingdom where you could have soldiers from the coast coming up to help them. It's not our problem.
Yeah.
It's just the Ironwoods problem. It's just the King Fowler's problem. It's not a Dornish problem. There isn't a Dorne as a nation state yet.
Yeah, and those differences in culture and terrain would be part of why they wouldn't feel as connected potentially. Those developments. The sandy ones are the desert folk, which you can tell by the name. It seems like they would probably have the most quote-unquote original First Men heritage, given the Andals would be the least interested in that territory. So you agree with that?
I would agree with that, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So
the Andals would have been fairly rarely in the mountains, and then when the Rhoynish showed up, I mean, obviously, prior to the Rhoynish showing up, I guess they would also have been more First Manish. Although, again, being coastal, I mean, even if they don't have, there might have been more contacts with other people for trade and so on, and there might be more mixing that way. But the desert people are probably the most First Man in appearance. Or obviously, the idea is after thousands of years of some selection, they are fairly dark as well, and they must. I'm guessing there's not a lot of Aiel-like people from the Wheel of Time who, Irish redheads out of the desert.
Yeah.
They probably sunburn. Pretty, so yeah.
Yeah, we see so little of Dorne that we don't really know what their perspective is on these differences between them. They don't.
Oh yeah.
They don't define themselves this way that we can see, but do they have these sorts of prejudices against each other? Like I could see, a salty Dornishman judging a stony Dornishman pretty handily.
Yeah.
Like we see the differences from these, but they would notice a lot more differences. Like living amongst each other, they would be a lot more keen on what separates their cultures and things like that.
Yeah.
Like
I would think so.
Yeah, like for example, like a good example in the real world would be a lot of people would hear Spanish and think in a lump like this is Spanish speaking, but within Spanish speaking, there's massive differences of culture. I mean, you go from one end to the other. I mean, there's just huge differences from like Mexico to Spain. Just
or you go into for example, you think about in like I don't know, Brazil, something like that, where someone who's black there is defined very differently than who is black here in the United States, and whether if you're mixed race is defined entirely differently there in their culture, and I imagine it's similar in Dorne as well.
I would imagine so as well. Yes, they probably have a kind of their own concepts of these things and conceptualizations. I mean, how many think about their Andal heritage as being especially important, for example, versus just the general mountain Dornish sort of raiding culture is more important to them, or how many of them care more about the history of the Lord of the Wells than the fact that
yeah.
first men.
Mhm.
Or the
founded
orphans
that
would be more attached to their Rhoynish history.
Definitely. That
Yeah.
one's a little
Absolutely.
easier, probably. You're
They
right. Good
definitely
point.
It's like Spain
Yeah,
and
recall-
Portugal, or speak different languages, but still might get lumped in together
Yeah.
with Spanish culture, quote unquote.
I recall asking George once, and I expect this to speak Martin, about whether any of the old Rhoynish gods were still worshipped.
Oh.
And he thought that maybe some people. I'm guessing, obviously, he probably didn't have the idea of the orphans at the time, but he probably, I don't know if it might have sparked the idea of the orphans, but the orphans probably still, they still, Mother Rhoyne is still the goddess for them.
Yeah, that's where I can
Yeah.
find that water magic.
Yeah, they're looking
Yeah.
for the
Water
water.
magic.
Yeah, because folks, if you don't recall, Yandri and Ysilla, who run that pole boat that Tyrion spends time on with Griff, they are from Dorne. They're orphans of the Greenblood that went back. They're like they felt the call, so to speak, and moved back to their ancestral heritage, but they weren't born there. They went back. They went to the Rhoyne. They migrated there to return to their mother, so to speak. So this is another interesting concept. Thinking about super ancient Dorne, like even before the arm was broken, you wonder if there was still active trade going back and forth. It may have been too prehistoric for things like that, but we don't want to limit ourselves on thinking that just because it was super old that they couldn't have long range trade, because there is examples of things like that in the ancient world as well. I mean, there weren't as many things that would be traded, but still it happened.
No, I mean, one of the most fascinating things about if you study Bronze Age Europe is that the incredible networks.
Yeah.
The way things could come from, things from amber from the Baltics found all the way down in the southern tip of Italy. It's just crazy what our ancestors were able to achieve, and how networked they were. I mean, the whole idea of the Bronze Age collapse theory, it partly turns on the idea that it was economically driven collapse of trade that led to all these problems. So there definitely would be trade. There is the whole thing about the first men. Like when you go as far back as the first men, the idea that they didn't really have boats.
Yeah.
Or but they needed the land bridge to get across. But I mean, and I believe the war was a fire. It has been a long time since I flipped through it again, and longer still since I wrote it. So I believe it has some stuff about the Ironborn possibly having. I recall there's some questions about like how the Ironborn, if they're supposed to be related to the first men, were they the first to come up with ships and so on. And there's this whole thing about that aspect of things about when was naval trade or really a thing. Because Dorne would probably have to depend a lot on that at some point, especially when particularly hostile periods of time with the rest of Westeros.
Yeah. Let's get a little specific with some of the foundings of some of these individual Dorne houses. We've got a couple of quotes to play with here. Yep, that one.
All right. North and east, beyond a great gap in the mountains that provided the shortest and easiest passage from Dorne to the Reach, House Fowler carved its own seat into the stony slopes overlooking the pass. Skyreach, that seat became known for its lofty perch and soaring stone towers. At the time, the pass it brooded over was commonly known as the Wide Way. Today we name it the Prince's Pass. So the Fowlers took for themselves the grandiose titles of Lords of Skyreach, Lords of the Wide Way, and Kings of Stone and Sky.
Well, when you get to take the best places, no one's going to stop you from calling you whatever you want to call yourself.
Yeah,
that is
even the Wide
cool,
Way.
That is a pretty cool title. But this makes sense. This is why I brought up trade, because obviously trade going back to Essos is a speculative thing, something we can kind of imagine, but without a lot of specifics. But trade through the two major passes of Dorne is a certainty. What level it existed back then is not a certainty, but it's certainly a thing now. And obviously that's why those places were taken by powerful interests back in the days, because someone recognized the value of controlling the pass and the other pass that the Ironwoods took, which we'll discuss in a second. So that's pretty similar. I think along the lines of House Frey, except they actually built the crossing themselves with a bridge, and this is more recent. But it's the same concept. You control the path, and you get to tax people, do whatever you want, and, well, the Fowlers have been holding on to that for who knows how many thousands of years, and with that comes a lot of prestige and wealth and entrenchment, I guess you could say. And then, unless someone wants to comment on that, let's go on to the next quote about the Ironwoods. It's kind of a similar little bit here.
I got it.
Cool.
In a similar vein, far to the east, where the mountains ran down to the Sea of Dorne, House Ironwood established itself in the high valleys and green foothills below the peaks and seized control of the Stoneway, the second of the two great passes into Dorne, one far steeper, narrower, and more treacherous than the wide way of the west. Well protected and comparably fertile, their lands were also well timbered and possessed of valuable deposits of iron, tin, and silver as well, making the Ironwoods the richest and most powerful of the Dornish kings, styling themselves the Blood Royals, Lords of the Stoneway, Master of the Green Hills, and High Kings of Dorne. The Lords of Ironwood in time ruled North Dorne, from the mountain domains of House Wild to the headwaters of the Greenblood, though their efforts to bend the other Dornish kings to their will were seldom successful.
That's kind of what Elliot was referring to before about so many petty kings in Dorne, perhaps even more so in other places. So many natural barriers and borders that enable these kingdoms to form independently and hold. They have like really strong home field advantage, you could say. But the Ironwoods had something that's a little unusual, is the silver mines. If you've been happen to be following my Crusader Kings streams on Friday, we're currently playing House Ironwood, and those silver mines are pretty nice in the game too. But sticking to the real canon here, talk about another fancy title. Geez, Blood Royals, Lords of the Stoneway, Master of the Green Hills, High Kings of Dorne, the Lords of House Ironwood. So, just as a quick aside note here, Ellie, you guys have a game, an RPG you've been running for a long time, and there's a lot to do with Dorne in there. Are the Ironwoods kind of a major figure or major presence in this?
Yeah, they have been in the past of the game. They led the rebellion against the Dorne,
Nice.
Dorne, after the whole fiasco of the Dornish conquest by Dayne and the occupation and so on. So yeah, we have definitely paid attention to the idea that if you're a family who were once kings and yet you're still hundreds of years later calling yourselves the Blood Royals, you definitely have an ego. You definitely have a lot of pride.
Yeah.
And you're going to cause a lot of trouble.
And that's what we've seen right throughout their history. They join the Blackfires and things like that. They've been looking for their ways up. They've been pretty peaceful in recent generations, I suppose, but you never know what'll change. I'm hoping that there's more time spent in Dorne in the future novels, and that we get a little more backstory in some of these things. I'm sure you're right there with me.
Yeah. Dorne is very popular with Lynn and I, so yeah, absolutely.
Nice. Now, here's a really interesting question. This is a difficult one. Not difficult isn't challenging, but difficult because we just don't have that much information, but it's more of an imaginative question. One theory that's proposed within the histories is that the Sea of Dorne used to be landlocked. That it was a proper lake, maybe even fresh water, and then as the arm of the same, perhaps forces, whether magical or not, that rose the seas, that broke the arm, also flooded the Sea of Dorne and made it a part of the Narrow Sea. If that's the case, if it was landlocked, that means the spot Ironwood is located would have been a lot different back then, and potentially even more powerful than it is now. They would have had a freshwater lake nearby, as well as the silver mines and the mountain pass. Yeah, I don't know if all that would have carried over so long, but it's something to think about. That's kind of neat to imagine that all being landlocked. That would have been more. There would have been more land bridges. There would have been even more land routes across to Essos too, which could have been powerful.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually. Yeah, I mean, then you could easily see that the idea that that the Maesters may not have their history right as far as Dorne being the first place. They could just easily gone into the Stormlands.
Yeah, right.
At the same time and spread in both directions.
And we know the Stormlands are really popular for the children.
Yeah. It's
I don't think that's like impossible, given I don't know, real world geography, if you will. I think there's a lake. I wish I meant to research this more before the episode, but I'm pretty sure there's a lake in Africa that has gone back and forth between being fresh and saltwater multiple times. because of rising sea
Well, the
levels.
Black Sea
And
is
it's got a
one.
lot of you.
Is that the one
What's
you're
that?
thinking of? The Black? You're not thinking of the Black Sea, obviously, but the Black Sea is an
No, I
example
don't think
of
it's the
that.
Black Sea.
The Black Sea used
There's
to be
probably
a
multiple
freshwater
when I
lake
think about it.
before
But,
it became part.
Is that Lake Victoria you're thinking of, Sean?
It might be Lake Victoria. Like I said, I remember I saw this in a documentary about evolution, and this lake had a lot of uniquely evolved life because of this back and forth between salt and freshwater. I think that's where cichlids come from.
Yeah, it
the
is.
fish
Yeah,
that you have.
it is. Because there were 3 lakes that there was one lake that separated into 3, and then over time it formed into 1 lake, and then over time it went back into 3 lakes. So it had these like weird evolutionary microcosms where it was together, so things formed, and then they evolved separately, and then they were combined again, and then started evolving together, and then separately again. So it's like really scientists and biologists have it's like a windfall of information, or a seafall, lake fall. I don't know. There's no wind down there unless you're patch face under the sea. No, yeah, under the sea. The wind blows. Okay, so moving on to our last quote around the formation of different Dornish houses. This is a very peculiar kind of under the radar mention of a different style of government. Pay close attention, folks. This is cool.
A second rival High King of Dorne also existed during the times of the First Men, ruling from a great wooden moat and bailey castle on the south bank of the Greenblood near Lemonwood, where the river flows into the Summer Sea. This was a curious kingship, for whenever a king died, his successor was chosen by election from amongst a dozen noble families that had settled along the river or the eastern shores. The Wades, Shells, Holts, Brooks, Hulls, Lakes, Brownhills, and Briars all threw up kings who ruled from the high hall amongst the lemon trees. But in the end, this curious system broke down when a disputed election set the royal houses to warring against one another. After a generation of conflict, 3 of the old houses were wiped from the earth, and the once powerful river realm had shattered into a dozen quarrelsome petty kingdoms.
That's super interesting. It's like instead of Naga's bones, they meet around the lemon tree. It's a lemon's moot. Yes. It's like a democratic, like a sort of proto-democracy, sort of great council situation. Did this pique your interest when this part was written, or do you have any thoughts on this? I find it really neat.
Oh, that was really interesting that George threw that out there. That was George's material. That it was a surprise to us as anyone else. It was never been hinted before prior to this in the book, so we had no idea. And George hadn't mentioned anything like it. So I presume he kind of came up with it in the course of basically writing the material. It wasn't necessarily something that was always present in the lore. But it was created as needed. But it's a cool idea. I mean, elective monarchies have existed. The Holy Roman Empire for a period of time was officially an elective monarchy, and then kind of sort of not anymore when the Habsburgs has kind of kept being elected over and over again. But yeah, and it makes sense that it's a thing that was tried. It worked for a while, but it kind of broke down, as I think most elective monarchies have had a history of having breakdowns of this kind, where it just doesn't function properly anymore. And there's this whole thing about balancing the power between the electors, those and then the king. I mean, if you're beholden to all these people who have elected you, can you really rule properly?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's a great point. Yeah, because it's like this is with so few votes, one vote means so much. You have people bribing and cheating and threatening, and yeah, it's not like that's why it's not a true democracy. It's more a proto-democracy, and that's similar to like at the King's Moot, they just flat out have that as part of it. Bribing people is just part of your presentation. You're like, how much loot are you going to give us? So they're a little more open with it there. I'm not saying they solved the problem, because there's a lot of issues with.
Yeah,
with
in
that,
modern democracy, we don't have any bribery or cheating or anything.
Yeah, exactly. So, but it is fascinating to think about that, and we wonder. One of the reasons I really wanted to point at this is, Shay, as earlier mentioned, of Great Council, is something that comes up several times in history, several examples of it. Yeah, and the TV show portrayed it as part of the ending, which doesn't mean it will be part of the ending, but there's a strong chance it'll there will be a Great Council in the books because of all this setup. And this, to me, is a little bit of that, as well as some really interesting world building.
Yeah, is this George saying that they're going to have a great council, but it's not going to stick? It
Yeah,
doesn't matter.
they're just like, nah,
Right.
it's not gonna
It's a
work out,
little
yeah.
rule, but then they're just back to
It would
it.
be disputed.
Yeah.
What are the chances it wouldn't be disputed?
So, Dorne's geography, with respect to not knowing when on the timeline some of these houses were founded versus when the arm was shattered versus whether the arm was shattered all at once or gradually, there would have been big changes in the region. Like House Drinkwater and House Tolland, for example, are like right where the arm would have been extended from. So it's possible they went through some serious upheaval if things change. Like, oh my goodness, we have a coast here now. We were the Swiss land, and now it's just we have waterfront property now. And that's also relevant for the Martells, because notice throughout all this discussion, the Martells haven't really been a part of it because they weren't really around. They may have existed in a minor state that wasn't notable, but they didn't really become a big deal till the Andals came around, which is different than a lot of the other major houses in other regions. And it might reflect the changes in geography, at least in part. I wouldn't guess that that's the major factor because they're so far apart, but anyway, consider where the location of Sunspear is when you consider rising and falling sea levels. It possibly would have been closer or farther out. Who knows? It's an interesting consideration for these things. Anyone have anything to add to that, or shall we move on to the actual breaking, which is our last topic for the day? All right, let's do the breaking. So, Elio, I really love how this is presented. It's presented with both the high magic version and the rational real world familiar version. That's kind of makes sense to people who have looked into this even a little bit. It feels kind of like it could fit, but like so many things with George, he likes to use real world stuff, but he leans into the magic. Like, it's more fun when it's magical.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No. Very true.
So let's have the quote, and then we'll talk about it, and that'll be our finale for the day.
The children fought back as best they could, but the first men were larger and stronger. Riding their horses, clad and armed in bronze, the first men overwhelmed the elder race wherever they met, for the weapons of the children were made of bone and wood and dragon glass. Finally, driven by desperation, the little people turned to sorcery and beseeched their Greenseers to stem the tide of these invaders. And so they did, gathering in their hundreds, some say on the Isle of Faces, and calling on their old gods with song and prayer and grisly sacrifice. 1,000 captive men were fed to the werewood, one version of the tale goes, whilst another claims the children used the blood of their own young.
Poof.
The old gods stirred, and giants awoke in the earth, and all of Westeros shook, trembled. Great cracks appeared in the earth, and hills and mountains collapsed and were swallowed up. And then the seas came rushing in, and the arm of Dorne was broken and shattered by the force of the water, until only a few bare rocky islands remained above the waves. The summer sea joined the narrow sea, and the bridge between Essos and Westeros vanished for all time. Or so the legend says.
I love that. Or so the legend says, and then it moves into the more rational explanation, which we'll get to in a second. But so this is the so-called Hammer of the Waters, which, if it was a magical event, wow, 1,000 captives and or the blood of their own young. What are we supposed to do with that? That's incredible. I mean, that's some serious business. I mean, on one hand, you kind of need. We've never seen the children or the Greenseers do anything so massive other than this, if they even did it. So, for example, I mean, in all the discussions of children fighting the first men, there's no like mini earthquakes or like landslides. We don't hear anything about that. It's not that it didn't happen, but we don't hear anything about it. So this seems kind of like maybe several steps above what we've seen their capacity be. But if you mix in this whole sacrifice business, this mass blood sacrifice, then that maybe explains it. But that could be a de facto explanation. They're like, well, they must have sacrificed 1,000 people to make this happen. That's the only way it could make sense. What do you think? How do you look at this, Elio? This event and all that?
Yeah, it's very mysterious. It's all this ancient history stuff. So it's no longer written lore. It's based on oral legends that eventually got thousands of years after the fact got written down by Andals. Again, it is more fun to think that the magical version of events is correct than the rational version. It is a setting with magic. It is a setting where there was great magic in the past. So I could see it, and I think the reference is sort of pretty casual of the sacrifices
Yeah.
of ties into the power of blood in the setting. A lot of the blood magic definitely has power. Definitely drives its power from blood.
True.
So sacrificing 1,000 people or 1,000 children of children, would be a very powerful thing. Would it be enough to do this? The other thing I would think about, the whole giants awakening in the earth. I mean, we have that in the Horn of Jormung, and it's a very mysterious thing there. Like, what are these giants in the earth? Is it just a term for a metaphor for earthquakes? Is there more to it? Very curious.
If it did require 1,000 people or children to sacrifice, that could explain why they didn't do it sooner. Either resistance to sacrificing their own people within their own culture, or the actual, like, we don't have 1,000 captive humans yet. We're still working on that. That wouldn't be something you could just whip up in a week or two. Like, yeah, let's just go grab 1,000 people. I mean, the children were outnumbered. How do they even take captives? Like, what are they? Yeah, it's hard, kind of difficult. Like, are they feeding them? Like, I don't know. It's a little bit hard to swallow, but not entirely. Like, because it could be, the number could be exaggerated. Maybe they just had to sacrifice a few people. That's very believable. And then you take what the show gave us, portraying like the creation of the others through the children, something we've long suspected is a part of the book canon as well. Well, that's a good example of extremely high magic, which makes giant tidal waves and breaking of earths a lot more plausible in terms of what their magic allows. And this is why I wanted to talk about the Rhoynish water magic, at least to rope it in a little bit, because that's kind of what it sounds like more than anything. Like giant floods, like that's the closest we have to that, I think. Am I missing something?
A couple thoughts.
Go ahead, Sean. Yeah.
One is it was I don't even know how involved the children were with the building of the wall, and that was probably a much longer term project. But
supposedly they had some
magical
involvement,
right? It certainly seems to have magic tied up in it.
Yeah,
and the volume of water in the wall is enough to fill a lake to overcome barriers with waves if it were to happen in some sort of sudden manner. It also could be that it went farther than they meant it to, right? Like if there was an interior lake in the first place and a small barrier was broken down that let the ocean rush in, it might have had a bigger impact than they intended from their original hammering. Maybe they thought it was a chisel and
yeah, I mean, it's not like they would have done this before, right?
Yeah.
So, all right, let's have the second half of the quote here so we can expand on the idea a little more.
Most scholars do agree that Essos and Westeros were once joined. 1,000 tales and runic records tell of the crossing of the first men. Today, the seas divide them, so plainly, some version of the event the Dornish call the breaking must have occurred. Did it happen in the space of a single day? However, as the songs would have it, was it the work of the children of the forest and the sorcery of their Greenseers? These things are less certain. Archmaester Cassander suggests elsewise in his Songs of the Sea how the lands were severed, arguing that it was not the singing of Greenseers that parted Westeros from Essos, but rather what he calls the song the Song of the Sea, a slow rising of waters that took place over centuries, not in a single day, and was caused by a series of long, hot summers and short, warm winters that melted the ice in the frozen lands beyond the shivering sea, causing the oceans to rise.
I find that very interesting. I mean, it's like the supernatural stuff is one thing, but that's pretty accurate to the real world in terms of how oceans rise and fall is because of the glaciers. So the Maesters are They're onto something here. That's pretty smart. Did you guys come up with Archmaester Cassander in that book, and or this passage?
believe so. The title of the book certainly sounds like one that we would come up with. I would have to. Is that as a sidebar?
Yeah,
To the main text.
pretty sure.
I'm almost familiar with that one. Yeah, we wanted to kind of throw the idea that the maesters, there are maesters who try to figure out how things from the stories were not magic, were actually rational things that could be understood rationally. Um, Interestingly, of course, I mean, we're talking about a pre-Long Night event,
Yeah.
and he's talking about long summers and short winters, which implies that he believes the seasons have been out of whack all along, or at least that far back. I'm sure there are other maesters who have put forward that I think the book actually references that
It does.
there are maesters who say that, that was not the case.
That seasons were regular, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you see, there's these different conceptions, kind of even within the maesters. I like the idea that the maesters have active argument about things, especially about this stuff where they don't have they don't have carbon dating. They don't have something that they can use to actually figure these things out. So it's all just theorizing and kind of mental exercises of trying to think like what makes the most sense.
Yeah, and you figure too, there's a lot of incentive because they really want to, at least we're presented with this notion, especially from people like Marwyn, that they really want to push back against the magical stuff as much as possible. They almost not denigrate it. Well, some of them do denigrate it. Someone like Lewin doesn't denigrate it so much as just kind of like, I've given up on it. Like, whereas some of the hardcore archmaesters are like, no. So it's like they have a very strong incentive to come up with these reasons. But this works because it reflects what we know about the real world so very well. And that's awesome. Speaking of a couple of real world examples, I mentioned Beringia. I don't know if that's how you say it, which is the land that used to be the Bering Sea. It used to be a grassland steppe, which is neat because it's kind of ironic. It was open during the Ice Age. It's like the Ice Age is when you could cross it, and then at other times, the glaciers were blocking it. So it's kind of like backwards almost. So there was a limited window to cross. But that's something that pushes it towards a magical explanation, actually. The so-called limited window for humans to cross the Bering Strait when it was a land bridge was still like 5,000 years long. So limited is on a global timescale. So really, that's not very limited if you think about it. So it's kind of hard for me to picture 5,000, 4,000, 3,000, 2,000 just years of this when it's framed as a single event that happened in one day or all at once, because I'm not sure the legends would support such a gradual thing like that. Would the story really be told this way if it was more gradual? I'm not sure. What do you guys think about that? Any takes, any thoughts on that?
I think it could be just, I don't know, thinking about like the potential real scientific explanation. It maybe could be one day, but doesn't necessarily have to be tens of thousands of years either. So the way tectonic plates work, a couple like bits of evidence in real world, which I don't know if George was necessarily incorporating this or even aware of this, but plates, there's basically three ways that they move. They can get pushed up against each other, right? Now like crunch mountains upward, right? Or they can be separated apart, which will cause like a dip, or they could like shift along laterally. Well, the one where they spread apart and dip, that's called a normal fault line. That's the normal one, is for them to spread apart.
Is that what you think this one probably sounds like?
That would make sense if it's spread apart. If there was already a relatively narrow division of the difference in sea level, and that was spread apart to and now it might not necessarily happen in one day, but maybe a series of earthquakes, if you will, over a few years, it could have happened. And additionally, by the way, ore deposits like silver, for example, are typically found along fault lines because either the earth ripping apart reveals them, or they create areas for water to flow and bring minerals with them. And so we know that there's silver nearby. It makes sense that the fault line, we know it
so
seems
silver
like
is evidence of a fault line. Interesting.
Right. So now maybe magic caused the fault line. You know, like it could be some combination of magic and actual geographical natural events.
Right, like I like to
Maybe
imagine
one
if it
triggered the
was
other,
magic,
but
they just like pushed the natural forces, like they give them a little boost.
Yeah.
You know, like they just
might have only taken a little magic if it was already a narrow division of the sea and there's already fault line there.
Like picture a
and so
bathtub
on.
that's almost overflowing. It's not overflowing, and then all of a sudden it's overflowing, then it's constantly overflowing. Like water is constantly pouring out from then on. Water is pouring out unless someone stops it. But you could also imagine like a whole person jumps into that bathtub and then it just
a huge wave would flow out, but then would stop afterwards. It would like stabilize, you know, so
super interesting. A lot of possibilities there. I wonder too if we're imagining it wrong. Like, was it that the sea levels rose above it? Because in some ways it's expressed as like it says an earthquake, which could have meant it sank. Like, did the seas rise or did it sink or something entirely different? I don't know.
Maybe they tried to construct a giant ice wall that it didn't hold, and when it melted, all the water went everywhere. First, they tried to block the arm with a giant ice wall.
That's where the first wall was built. They're like, shouldn't build walls in the desert. Oh boy! A little piece of trivia. This is not terribly relevant, but it stood out to me because it's neat. Gray wolves, which of course wolves are obviously a big part of the story. Gray wolves may have been almost extinct and pushed back, and they survived on this Bering Sea land bridge. And then when it opened back up and climate had changed, they spread back out everywhere. So there's some evidence for that gray wolves, that was their refuge. So, and of course George is a big supporter of wolves as well with his what's it called? Was the I've forgotten the name. The Wild Wolf Foundation, Spirit Wolf. I can't recall. Someone will look that up for me.
Wild Spirit Wolf Sanctuary.
Wild Spirit Wolf Sanctuary. Thank you.
I really didn't think it was gonna have spirit in it.
Yeah.
Right on. Yeah, I really. I was like, does it have spirit in it?
Yeah.
So there was also Doggerland, which connected Europe to Great Britain, and that was submerged even more, like 8,000 years ago. So, not super long ago. Australia used to be linked to Tasmania and New Guinea. Indochina was connected to Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. So these are all warming and cooling events. So we have a lot of real-world examples of connections made and lost via long-term changes. Still,
Texas used to be connected to the United States.
Oh boy!
Now, most of those cases are obviously not catastrophic changes, like Thuringia and so on. It was over time of sea rise, generally related to like the ice ages and ending and so on. And I mean, when you think catastrophic, I mean, I think the Black Sea.
Oh yeah.
There's the theory that the stories of the flood related to the breaking of the separation of the Black Sea from the rest of the ocean, the Mediterranean, I guess, if I recall right. And I mean, it's crazy theory, but if something like that happened, if people remembered that would be like a sudden, like this incredible flood out of nowhere. But when we're talking about land bridge, I mean, unless that land bridge was, surrounded by water and then some other walls of rock around it, but stopped, it is difficult to see how the unless we want to talk about but the magic of the children caused a global scale rise of seawater.
An earthquake,
which would then surely everyone around the world would have noticed. Hey, the ocean is kind of suddenly went up.
Like, hey, stop that over there.
Maybe the earthquake side of it, the sinking side of things might be more accurate, but it was actually a great catastrophic. And I mean, funnily enough, I mean, we're doing this today. You heard the story of the explosion of the volcano near Tonga, the tsunamis that have reached. I think I saw some footage from Santa Cruz with the water.
Really, all the way. I knew it got to Australia, but wow,
so on.
Jeez,
yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah, it does really have that vibe. I mean, not to make light of it, but yeah, yesterday there was a volcano in Tonga, and today it's snowing in Georgia. So it's like, the doom is upon us. But that is doom, like Doom of Valyria level power, right? Like you're causing, well, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like a similar sort of natural disaster that changed
Oh, yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, not so natural disaster.
Or not so natural, right? Natural seeming. It has that natural veneer to it. And at the same time, or possibly not, the flooding of the neck happened, which is a subject we'll explore separately, but it's important to link these two because there's a lot of thought that these things happen at the same time. If the sea levels rose, that would fit very well, that it would flood other areas of the continent, and this would, if that's a lower sea level area, then it fits pretty well. Do you have any thoughts on the connection between those two events, or is that just to kind of speak for itself?
I think it speaks for itself. I think there is some reasonable notion that there's a connection there. Oh, I do think about the people who complain about the geography aspect of it all in the swamp today.
It's if we get really big on the supernatural, we start to think about the possibility that even the erratic seasons are a cause of something. Well, we think the erratic seasons are magical or nature, quite possibly, but not necessarily that that was caused by the children. But certainly that idea gets floated. Now that is where we get into the possibility of things outside the planet itself. That's when you get into the possibility of something, astronomical events, moons leaving or coming or going or blowing up, or comets passing by, or just weird stuff that we don't have the degrees to properly theorize on, but certainly is possible, especially when you throw magic in the mix. I know I've mentioned before on the show the comet. Go ahead.
I mean, George has said. I mean, there is, when fans have asked him about like theories about it, it's magic. Like there is he has no. I mean, you can come up with it's for a fun possible cosmological explanations or astronomical explanations for the physics of it and how it works. But in his mind, it's magic, and that's it. He doesn't want to think about it. I thought Sean was talking about the tilt of the planet earlier. I kind of think that's kind of because, I mean, the seasons are matched with the length of night and day changing as well, and that's absolutely a tilt thing. But does that mean that the magic involved, if you want to think of it that way, is literally causing the precession, the tilt of the planet to change erratically? That's really weird.
Yeah,
it's kind of crazy to imagine that happening without having, but it's magic, and that's all there is to it. So from George's perspective, I mean, fans can try and come up with clever ways to make it work in the physical sort of reality way, but his idea, this is a magical thing, and I really do believe that it has something to do with the others and the long night and all that, but at some point in the past, the seasons were normal.
Yeah. And that's a good thing to close with, an homage to, yes, it's real world explanations are fun. They fit in some ways here, but it's probably magic powering it all. And that's, from a meta perspective, George is doing his own version of what a lot of fantasy authors have done and will continue to do, is to have a cataclysm or multiple cataclysms in the past, or as part of the main story, depending on how they want to do it. Like the Wheel of Time, we've mentioned several times in this episode, has the breaking of the world. Certainly, the great trilogy Broken Earth by N.K. Jemisin has a whole lot of stuff with geology and magic, and I won't be specific because a lot of y'all haven't read that yet, but you should read it. It's really damn good. And it will be a TV show eventually too, so.
Even if it was demonstrated that there was real magic in the real world, which, quantum physics almost is, right? But I would still try to come up with a physical explanation for it. I might change my perspective and be more open, more minded to weird stuff, but I would still be trying to justify or understand how magic worked within the rules of physics,
A lot of fantasy novels do that. Like they study magic. They try to do repeatable, like test it and make it repeatable. Like they treat it as if it was a science of sorts. And that I appreciate that. So it's kind of what you're saying there, right, Sean?
Yeah.
Yeah. They don't have
even
the
just
means
now,
to do it here in this world is the problem, I suppose. The Maesters, they don't have it's not as developed in Westeros to.
Just now, my mind was spinning on the idea of how to reconcile the idea of like magic, but also, natural phenomenon. Like we've talked about how like magic maybe has a price, and maybe even sometimes you don't realize the effects of the magic that you're doing, and like the rotation of the earth, even things like the atmosphere is due to the molten core churning from the earth's rotation, which creates a magnetic field which blocks sun rays, which allows the atmosphere to form. Who knows if maybe some practice of magic affects the molten core of Planetos, which might have made the doom of Valyria, when it might have been the result of some magic practice churning up lava into the etc.
Yeah, these two things work together. It's just not like I used the example like last week that yes, it's all magic, but like George isn't going to just have someone cast a spell and be a blizzard in the desert. It's going to make a little more sense than that. It's going to be like maybe a windstorm in the desert, something.
And George
like
probably also didn't decide magic is connected to lava and that's what sparked the, he probably didn't do that either.
Maybe a specific mountain, but not all lava probably. Yeah.
But he may grow that in his garden. My mind's going to spin off that way one way or the other.
You never know. That's right. But hey, and with that, let's leave it there. This has been a lot of fun. We had a lot of rabbit holes, as we like to do, and we had an amazing and knowledgeable guest to do it with. Thank you so much for coming today, Elio. We had a nice long discussion. We kept you up late.
My pleasure.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
It's not a problem.
So does that mean we're still not going to speak of those living along the banks of the brimstone?
You would like to speak to them, huh? You'd like to have words with them. Like, how did you make this work? It's one thing to live in the frigid north, but you're living next to undrinkable water. How exactly?
There's a line where the maester says, we won't even speak of them. I'm like, well, why not?
So again, thank you, Elio, World of Ice and Fire author, Westeros.org co-founder, Wiki of Ice and Fire manager, YouTube channel Westeros, World of Ice and Fire app. And did I forget anything? I wrote all that at the begining and I didn't scroll back to it. I think that's everything. Yep. Anything else you want to shout out or mention as we close out here?
No. Just looking forward to what more comes and from you guys and from other people, just kind of discussing the books and discussing just the fandom in general. It's been great to see when it felt there was a time literally when it was dozens of us.
That's great.
Dragonstone, all the way to now where there are hundreds of thousands of us and discussing it. That's really cool.
It's super cool. You're right. It really did grow. Like in a way, this whole episode is very meta because we're talking about the early times of Westeros, and you're talking about the early times of the fandom, and it really all
literal early
works
times
together.
Of Westeros.org.
Yes, we're just taking everything back to the beginning today. That was our goal. I hope we did a good job. Thanks everybody for listening. Let me say thanks to. Go ahead, Sean.
I was going to say at the rate we're going, we're probably going to sum all this up next week.
Also, folks, keep an eye out. We'll post links to other interviews that Elio and Linda have done about the World of Ice and Fire and just other topics. There's some of these are relevant to this or just of interest in general. Be sure to check out our House Dayne episodes if that piqued your interest. And of course, we'll see a lot of y'all next week for more coverage of the World of Ice and Fire. Thanks to those of you who came and watched live. If you're catching this after the fact on video or on the podcast edited version, thanks for that as well. You can join the discussion offline, or rather not during the live stream, on our Discord page or on our Facebook page. You can interact with us on Twitter or email, as always. If you're a patron of the show, we thank you so very much. We appreciate your support, that you're keeping the lights on for us, even as we're battling winter snow here. That's even more important than usual, isn't it? Leave a rating if you are so inclined. We don't ask for that very often, but it is an important thing in the algorithm. Spotify has recently added ratings, so we're back to mentioning that because it used to just be iTunes and certain podcatchers. Now, Spotify being such a huge player in the market, the fact that they're doing ratings now is a whole reason to sort of mention that again and get involved.
Worth mentioning this here, if you are listening to us off Spotify and decide, hey, I want to go rate them on Spotify, even though I don't listen on Spotify, you have to listen before you can rate. It will not show up unless you have listened, the rating button.
Which I think is good.
It's a great thing, but just so you know, that's why.
It is a real pain. Like, it's not like a YouTube comment that if someone like writes a slur, you could just delete it. I mean, iTunes will delete slurs, but if someone just says something that's flat out not true, like one of our reviews says like I'm a terrorist or something, and I can't respond or delete it.
Aziz a terrorist.
It just says that.
Yeah.
I can't touch it. They probably didn't listen to any episodes.
Yeah, I don't
So
know.
that press the Spotify system would probably catch that. Anyway, also thanks to Nina for her notes and invaluable thoughts. Thanks to Joey and Jesse for the music. And Mike Kevin McLeod as well for the Valar Rereadis intro music. Michael Klarfeld, your maps sitting behind us, looking beautiful and awesome. Thanks to the Bengineer for our sound quality assistance. Oh no, a last minute request. Elio, we have a recurring thing on this show. We haven't done it in quite a while. Can you please say Irish wristwatch
3 times
3
fast.
times?
Irish wristwatch. Irish wristwatch. Irish wristwatch.
It's not.
That's not an easy one. That is not
It's not easy.
Yep, I'm glad that got in there. That was last second there. No Here Be Dragon stream this week, so we will just shout them out in general rather than a specific topic. But we will see you all next time for more Valar.
Can I
Oh, yeah,
actually
go ahead.
this one little thing? I
Sure.
just the file had this one little thing at the end. I don't know if that's just for a future topic. Or if
Yeah.
it was for the construct of knowledge.
Yeah, we
Oh,
said
We just didn't get to it.
Yeah, we
I
always
realized
like-
we had too much stuff.
Yeah, we never
but
know
it-
how much we'll get to.
Okay.
So
But if
go
you want
on.
to comment on
All right.
that briefly, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I feel it's I maybe I mean, are you guys gonna touch on it in a future episode or?
Please
did you
go
want
into it.
You
we're,
should go
we're
into
in no
it.
rush. We're
Well,
only wrapping up for
okay,
your sake.
Yeah.
I okay. Well, I'm fine because I do want to. I'll reveal something since I. Could someone read
This?
the text? Yeah.
Okay, I will.
Yeah. Real quick, let me introduce what
Oh,
this
yeah,
is.
introduce
This is
it.
from the early
Yeah.
part of the book. This is like something I wanted to discuss as a side topic at some point. We kept pushing it. I thought we might talk about it today, but it's just we've taken too much time on the other stuff. The idea being that knowledge is a process, that things get added onto, that everyone is looking back on what came before and building on that. It's a really important like human concept. It's a real world concept, and I really, really appreciate that was in the book. So whatever you wanted to say, Elio, or first,
Yeah.
the
First,
quote
I'll read the
itself.
quote.
Yeah.
All right.
Go for it.
It is-
Yeah.
It is said with truth that every building is constructed stone by stone, and the same may be said of knowledge, extracted and compiled by many learned men, each of whom builds upon the works of those who preceded him. What one of them does not know is known to another, and little remains truly unknown if one seeks far enough. Now I, Maester Yandel,
Nice.
take my turn as mason, carving what I know to place one more stone in the great bastion of knowledge that has been built over the centuries both within and without the confines of the citadel, a bastion raised by countless hands that came before and which will, no doubt, continue to rise with the aid of countless hands yet to come.
Did you write that part too?
Yes, sort of.
Nice.
But I actually I've never. No one's ever. So I'll read something here. but it
Yeah,
sounds very
please.
familiar.
Okay.
It is said with truth that every building is constructed stone by stone, and that all great rivers are made up from many springs and streams. So knowledge is extracted and compiled by many learned men. What one of them knows is unknown to another, though nothing is unknown if one seeks far enough. Therefore, to enter upon the subject which I have undertaken, first trusting in the grace of God and of the Blessed Virgin Mary, from whom all consolation and advances come, I will base my work on the true chronicles formerly brought together by the wise and venerable Sir John Lebel, Canon of St. Lambert of Liege, etc., etc. That is from. I cannot take credit. I was inspired by when I wrote this by. Let me see. So
Oh, I see.
Froissart, his chronicles of the 100 Years' War. This
Oh,
is
wow.
when I moved from the United States here. I brought among the books I brought with me were a few of the books from my university classes that I found, and I had a medieval history course with Dr. Hugh Thomas, and all of the books that he had assigned are at least 3 of them are direct inspirations to certain passages in the World of Ice and Fire.
Now we gotta
So
find the
the
other
other
two.
thing actually for start, the other thing for start does actually at the very start is he talks about his idea is that to what is it? The exact phrase is kind of a loose inspiration for what Yandel says about his intentions is in the order that the honorable enterprises, noble adventures, deeds of arms that took place during the wars waged by France and England should be fittingly related and preserved for posterity, so that brave men should be inspired thereby to follow such examples. That should place on record these matters. So,
cool.
So Yandel's idea that this is a didactic work, but pedagogical work that will teach people to behave better by the example of people who came before them. Is also inspired by that. I've always no one's ever. I mean, it's a blatant bit of plagiarism for that. So no one's ever come across it. So I figured, why not? Since you had that quote there, I would bring it up.
Oh, I'm so glad you
awesome.
brought that up. Yeah,
Very cool.
that's so perfect. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that is really good. Yeah, we talked about that a little bit, like just off and on, how so many things are added onto like that. That's so cool. Thank you for sharing that with us. That was a really good postscript.
I think it's appropriate for the history of Westeros channel. that bit of medieval history. I mean, one of the things we did when we researched writing this is we went and I refreshed myself on First Start. I looked at Herodotus and Pliny and various other histories, just to get an idea of how a historian. Because I mean, one of the things that comes up about these books, this and Fire and Blood, is they're not history. These historians are not very historian-ish in the way that we think of historians. They are, to be history is, especially when Yandel's trying to do a kind of a vernacular, popular-ish history. He's writing for a very different audience and very different mindset of how things work. It's not the same as, and I would guess George is using the same idea for like Dayne. They're not really. Historiography is really in its infancy. I mean, we can talk about Herodotus being like the first.
Yeah, I've read Herodotus. Yeah, it's
modern historian, and we're talking. I mean, Herodotus is actually I was thinking of Thucydides. Actually, and Thucydides is very great, but he made up stuff all the time. He said so explicitly. Like I don't know about this dialogue, so I'm making this stuff up by what I think was appropriate. And it's very interesting, but to me, it's like I think these maesters are perfectly prepared to make things up, to fit what they feel like has to be right, and you get into really complicated areas of this. And obviously, at the same time, it is a work of fiction. It is a work of so the balance between actual history and how a historian in the past would handle things, how they would present or understand knowledge, is very different, I think, from how a modern person would think about it. And we certainly tried with Yandel and all these various books. Like as you mentioned, we created a lot of these other maesters and their books that we would reference in the sidebars and so on.
Yeah, I love those.
We kind of came up with this idea of having all these very, very different approaches to it, of trying to expand on knowledge, and it often leading conflicting and ambiguous, and sometimes the maesters seem to be interested in stuff that seems aimed at the bleachers. At the lower class. There's stuff about the sexual habits of people, or like why, and it's like, well, he's writing, he knows his audience.
That's so good. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I think it's super fun to consider how these things were made and to try to get in that mindset. And it seems like you guys did a really good job of that. I really respect that. I appreciate that. I'm not an expert on all these old sources, but I have read Thucydides and I have read Herodotus, so I totally see what you're saying. And I hope that rings true for other people too, because it certainly does for me. And I think it really does. I think the pages, I think it comes out like that. I think people feel that.
I think we started off in the first episode talking about the idea that you have to consider the source.
Yes.
What their potential biases or holes of knowledge would be, even if they're trying to be honest and so on.
And that's true within the main story too. I mean, you have an unreliable narrator as part of each POV too. So it's not, we're preconditioned to that in A Song of Ice and Fire and the real world.
Actually, it's funny because one of the topics that had come out, times about like the World of Ice and Fire, like, oh, is it canon? Is it like really canon or not? And it's like, it is a work of history within Westeros.
Yeah,
So it is canon.
it
in the sense
exists.
that this is what a maester would write. It exists. It's an actual thing. Is it right about everything? Absolutely not. I mean, there are things in there that I like when Yandel talks about the theory that the others were probably a tribe of savage firstmen.
It's like,
I know that he's wrong.
Yeah.
The whole point is that everyone knows that he's wrong.
Yeah.
He just doesn't know it yet.
Or when he says
So,
giants are extinct, we're like, we saw them. One spoke.
Exactly. So I thought that we were pretty clear with those things. Like, of course, not all of this can be right, but it is a work of what a maester actually would believe in Westeros.
Yeah, it's very authentic in that way. Yeah.
Is it canon that Joffrey is Robert's son? Is that canon? No, like just to challenge
the history
idea of what
books
canon
will
means,
probably
you know?
say that, or maybe not.
The official genealogy has that, so it is canon that the official genealogy.
I remember people who would argue that Jon is Ned's son because that's what it says in the appendix. You know, it's like, like, well,
yeah,
well, he did raise him. He is his father, but his sire.
Did the appendix define son?
Yeah, right. Yeah, how do you mean son?
Yeah.
So anyway, yes. Well, that was awesome. I'm glad we got this postscript added on to this episode because this is going to probably end up being one of the best parts. And I can kind of edit it back into the main section too if I want, but we'll see about that. Anyway, thanks again, everyone. I already said the full thanks, so we won't go through that again. But appreciate
Thanks, Aziz,
everyone
for not
being here.
putting me through
Appreciate
that.
you all being part of this community. This is what it's all about. Great times. And don't forget, give her gifts, GIVHER, gifts.com. Check them out. This room smells really good now. Beeswax is the way to go. Until next week, everybody, for more Valar Rereadis.